The airport was bustling. The low hum of chatter, the sharp calls of gate attendants, and the frantic beeping of ticket scanners created a constant symphony of travel. But for Emily, a 28-year-old flight attendant with a habit of holding everything together, it felt more like a battlefield. She was rushing through the terminal, trying to get everything sorted before boarding began. First class was already filling up, and the last thing she needed was more problems. But that's exactly what she got when a man in a gray hoodie and sunglasses approached her desk. Emily looked up, flashing a quick, professional smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" The man's face was calm, almost unreadable. He held up his boarding pass with a slight shrug. "I'm in first class," he said, his voice deep and smooth. Emily glanced at the pass, then back at him. He didn't look like a first-class type. At least, not in the way the usual wealthy flyers did. He wasn't in a sharp suit or carrying an expensive briefcase. But his boarding pass checked out, and everything seemed fine on paper. "Everything looks good, sir, but there seems to be a small issue with your seat assignment." Emily's fingers moved quickly over her computer screen, her eyes narrowing as she checked the details again. There was a mismatch in the system. "It says here that you're assigned to business class. Let me sort that out for you." His eyes flickered with something like amusement, but Emily didn't notice. She was too focused on solving the problem in front of her. "No, that's not right. I'm supposed to be in first class," he repeated, a bit more firmly this time. Emily's brows furrowed. She was used to this kind of back and forth. People who expected special treatment because of who they were or what they did. "I'm sorry, but I can't just let you through without confirming this with the gate. We've had a few issues with seat assignments lately, and I need to double-check." She pointed to the nearby desk, indicating where she could get confirmation. The man sighed, but he didn't argue. Emily could sense his annoyance, though. She was just doing her job, but in the high-pressure world of first-class service, passengers often expected a smoother experience. "Let me take care of this, sir. It'll just be a minute," Emily said, her tone warmer now, trying to reassure him. He nodded, his sunglasses never shifting, and leaned back slightly against the counter, waiting. Emily stepped away to talk to the gate agent. When she returned moments later, her stomach twisted with an odd sense of unease. There was nothing wrong with the man's seat after all, but she just confirmed something that made her regret her decision. "You're right," Emily said, her voice a little tight. "It seems the system was incorrect. Your seat has been reassigned to first class. Please feel free to board as soon as you're ready." She smiled awkwardly, hoping the mistake hadn't soured his opinion of her completely. The man didn't immediately respond. Instead, he pulled his sunglasses down, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though considering her carefully. And in that moment, Emily's stomach did a flip. She felt like she was being watched, but not in the usual way she was accustomed to as a flight attendant. This was different. There was something almost intimidating about his gaze. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, but carrying an undercurrent of something else, something she couldn't place. Emily smiled again, unsure of how to read the situation. She returned to her post, only to be greeted by another passenger's question. As the man made his way toward the jet bridge, Emily didn't give him much more thought. She had other passengers to attend to, but as he disappeared from view, a strange thought lingered in her mind. Who was he? The next few minutes flew by. Emily's routine kicked back in as she worked with a steady rhythm. But then, when she reached the gate for boarding, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face. Wait, was that? Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the man from earlier was walking down the jet bridge, now fully in view. And with that realization, everything clicked into place. She froze, her eyes going wide. Oh no, Dwayne Johnson. The man she had just turned away wasn't just a regular passenger. He wasn't just some random guy. He was Dwayne Johnson, the famous actor, businessman, and now, apparently, the owner of the airline. Emily's mind raced. She'd just rejected the owner of the airline. The thought made her knees go weak. It felt like her professional world had just crumbled into dust. The wave of realization hit her hard, followed by an overwhelming sense of dread. What had she done? Her hands shook slightly as she tried to refocus. Her co-workers were busy attending to the boarding passengers, unaware of the disaster that was unfolding in her mind. Then, she heard someone approaching behind her. "Excuse me," a familiar voice said, low and calm, sending a chill down her spine. Emily turned around slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Dwayne Johnson was standing right there, a few feet away from her, his presence undeniable. "Yes," she managed, her voice coming out more breathy than she intended. "You just made a mistake," he said, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry, but there was something about his tone that made her nervous. It wasn't the way he spoke in public, charming, smooth, confident. No, this was different. This was raw. Emily could only nod, unable to form the words she needed to apologize. How could she explain that she had no idea who he was, no idea she was talking to the owner of the entire airline? "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, her voice small. Dwayne studied her for a moment, a slight tilt to his head as if considering her reaction. Then, he sighed, an almost imperceptible chuckle escaping him. "Don't worry about it," he said simply, his voice still steady. "Everyone makes mistakes." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this mistake might just cost her more than she could afford. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Emily sat at the flight attendant break room, clutching her coffee mug a little too tightly as the reality of what had just happened settled in. Her mind kept replaying the moment when she turned away Dwayne Johnson, over and over again. She had told herself it was just another passenger mix-up. But now that she knew who he was, that brief exchange felt like a punch to the gut. How could I not know? Emily muttered to herself, glancing around the break room. A few other flight attendants were scattered about, chatting with each other, but she didn't feel like she could join them. The weight of the situation kept her glued to her seat, her mind elsewhere. This was exactly the kind of mistake she couldn't afford to make. It wasn't just about the embarrassment of rejecting someone famous. It was about her career. She'd worked so hard to get to this point, fighting tooth and nail for every opportunity. And now, this mistake could be the one thing that would push her out of the game. The truth was, Emily had always felt like she had to prove herself more than everyone else. She was always trying to keep up with the more experienced flight attendants, always trying to make sure that no one ever saw her as the newbie. It wasn't easy, especially when she was younger than most of her colleagues. At 28, she had already been a flight attendant for 5 years, but it felt like there was always someone with more connections, more seniority, or more natural charm. Emily wasn't like them. She didn't have the glamorous background or the perfect smile that seemed to open doors for everyone else. Instead, she had her work ethic, her determination, and her fierce desire to make her mark. Her thoughts drifted to her past. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, Emily had always felt overshadowed by her family. Her mother had been a force of nature, a woman who had the kind of energy that made her the center of every room. People admired her strength, her charisma, her ability to make anyone feel like the most important person in the world. Emily's father, on the other hand, was always distant, emotionally absent, even when he was physically present. He worked long hours at a job he hated, and when he wasn't working, he was retreating into his hobbies or simply disappearing into the silence of their house. In many ways, Emily had always felt like she was just there. Not quite noticed, not quite important enough. She was never the one everyone turned to for advice or help. She was the one who had to prove her worth, even to her own family. It was no surprise that she had left Ohio the moment she turned 18, hoping to find a place where she could define herself. She had dreamed of doing something big, something that would make her stand out. Becoming a flight attendant wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. She loved the idea of traveling, meeting new people, and living a life that was different from what she had known. It was her chance to be someone else, someone more confident, more capable. But even as a flight attendant, it wasn't easy. Emily was constantly trying to prove herself, especially when she worked under senior staff who had decades more experience than she did. It was a strange environment, where everyone had their own way of doing things, and the slightest mistake could cost you. There were nights when she would lie awake in bed, rehearsing her interactions, wondering if she could have done something differently. Now, though, after today, The thought of losing everything she'd worked for stung like a fresh wound. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing thoughts. But the image of Dwayne Johnson standing in front of her, the calm, almost impervious look in his eyes, haunted her. She couldn't understand it. Why hadn't he been angrier? Why had he let her off the hook so easily? But then again, maybe he hadn't let her off the hook. Maybe he was just indifferent. The truth was, Emily didn't know anything about him beyond the headlines, and the way he had spoken to her made her feel like he could see right through her, like he knew she was small time compared to him, and he didn't even have to make a big deal out of it. "Hey, Em," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Emily opened her eyes to find Megan, one of her fellow flight attendants, standing at the door. Megan was one of the more experienced crew members, always calm under pressure and quick to offer advice to the rookies. She had a quiet confidence about her that Emily both admired and envied. "Hey," Emily replied, sitting up straight and forcing a smile. She didn't want anyone to know how shaken she was. Not yet, at least. Megan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I heard about what happened with the guy in first class. You okay?" Emily sighed. "I messed up, Meg. Big time." She didn't even have to say who the guy was. Megan knew. Everyone in the airline knew who Dwayne Johnson was. It was impossible not to. Megan raised an eyebrow. "You mean you didn't know who he was?" Emily's face flushed. "No, I didn't. I just thought he was another one of those guys trying to get into first class without the right seat assignment. He looked, I don't know, casual. Not like someone who would be the owner of the whole airline." She couldn't help the bitterness that crept into her voice. Megan chuckled softly, but there was a hint of sympathy in her eyes. "You weren't the first to make that mistake. Believe me. Don't let it get to you. It happens." Emily shook her head. "It's not just about making a mistake. It's about, well, I'm not like you or the other crew members who have connections, who get noticed. I have to work harder to even be taken seriously." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "What if this cost me everything I've worked for? What if I lose my job over this?" Megan stepped closer, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You're good at what you do, Em. One mistake isn't going to undo all of that. Besides, I've seen you handle worse situations. Don't be too hard on yourself." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this time was different. The next few days felt like a blur for Emily. She had tried to shake off the anxiety that followed her encounter with Dwayne Johnson, but it was hard to ignore the whispers. She could feel it in the way her co-workers looked at her, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. Word traveled fast in the airline industry, and she knew everyone was talking about the incident with the famous owner. But it wasn't just the gossip that unsettled her. It was the weight of what she'd done, the feeling that she'd crossed a line she could never come back from. The next flight she worked after the encounter with Dwayne felt like a test. She had tried to act normal, throwing herself into the job with the precision she had honed over the years. But nothing felt the same. Her movements were too fast, her words too rehearsed, as though she were trying to outrun the haunting memory of her mistake. "Everything okay, Em?" Megan asked one afternoon as Emily rushed past her in the galley, making sure everything was in order before takeoff. Emily gave a tight smile. "Yeah, just keeping busy." Megan didn't press her. She knew better than to push when someone was obviously trying to avoid talking about something. But it didn't escape Emily's notice that Megan's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. She couldn't blame her. Emily had always been the one to put up walls, but now, those walls felt a little shakier, a little easier to see through. As the flight went on, the usual banter between the crew was subdued. Everyone was tired, but there was an underlying tension in the air, one that Emily couldn't shake. She had been on plenty of long-haul flights, but this one felt different. The passengers seemed restless, and the small hiccups that would normally go unnoticed felt amplified. But Emily's mind kept drifting back to one thing, Dwayne Johnson. The more she thought about him, the more questions bubbled up. Why had he been so calm? Why hadn't he gotten upset or yelled at her? She knew that, as the owner of the airline, he could have made her life miserable if he wanted to. He could have called in a complaint and had her removed from the flight immediately. He could have taken this mistake as an opportunity to show his power, to put her in her place. Instead, he had simply brushed it off. "Don't worry about it," he had said. That was it. And now, all she could think about was how little she actually knew him. The realization gnawed at her. Dwayne Johnson was the Dwayne Johnson, actor, entrepreneur, and one of the most recognized faces in the world. But on that flight, he hadn't been The Rock. He had just been another passenger, someone trying to get from point A to point B like everyone else. But even then, he had carried a kind of quiet authority about him that unsettled her. "Everything good with the service, Emily?" The voice of the captain snapped her out of her thoughts. She was standing at the front of the plane, her hands clasped behind her back as she looked out the window at the clouds rolling by. She turned to face him. "Yes, everything's perfect, Captain," she answered quickly. Too quickly. Her voice sounded too rehearsed. "Good, good," he replied with a nod before turning back to the cockpit. The rest of the flight continued uneventfully, but Emily couldn't stop replaying her interactions with Dwayne Johnson in her mind. She felt exposed, like her mistake had somehow stripped her of the one thing she had always been able to rely on, her confidence. The next morning, Emily was sitting at her kitchen table, sipping on a cup of coffee, scrolling through the news on her phone. A headline caught her attention. "Dwayne, The Rock, Johnson takes over new airline, promises to change the industry forever." Her stomach tightened. The article went on to discuss Dwayne's recent acquisition of the airline and his plans to modernize the customer experience, improve employee benefits, and create a more personalized travel experience for passengers. It was clear from the language that the focus was on making the airline stand out, and to Emily's dismay, it was full of glowing praise for the man himself. She swallowed, feeling a mix of awe and frustration. Dwayne wasn't just a celebrity. He was a business mogul now, with an entire company to run. He was, as the article put it, a game changer. But what did that mean for someone like Emily? Someone who was struggling to stay afloat in a world where it seemed like connections and status mattered more than anything else? It wasn't just about the encounter anymore. It was about the realization that Dwayne Johnson was an enormous force, and she was just another cog in the machine. She wasn't even a blip on his radar. The idea that she might have ruined her chances of working for him or even being part of his vision for the airline weighed heavily on her. Her phone buzzed, and Emily glanced down to see a message from Megan. "You okay? Heard there's an all-staff meeting tomorrow. Thought you might want to know." "Meg," Emily stared at the message for a moment, then quickly typed out a response. "Yeah, thanks. I'll be there." She wasn't sure why Megan had reached out. Maybe it was just a casual message, but Emily knew it wasn't a coincidence. Everyone knew about the infamous first-class incident, and it seemed that now, everyone was watching to see how Emily would handle the fallout. The next day, the all-staff meeting was held in a large conference room. Emily walked in quietly, trying to blend into the background. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her as she made her way to an empty seat. The hum of chatter died down as Dwayne Johnson himself stepped into the room, wearing a sharp suit and a confident smile. He was larger than life, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Good morning, everyone," Dwayne said, his voice rich and warm. "I'm excited to be here with you all today. As you know, we're about to embark on a new chapter in the airline's history. I've heard a lot of great things about this team, and I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you." Emily's heart skipped a beat. He was here. He was here. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and she quickly looked away, feeling her face flush. Dwayne's gaze had been sharp, but not unkind. He hadn't looked at her with the anger or disappointment she had expected. Instead, it was more like he was watching to see how she would react. He went on to outline his vision for the airline, talking about the new direction they would be taking, the changes he planned to implement, and the importance of customer experience. But despite the excitement in the room, Emily's thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't escape the sense that her mistake had already been forgotten by him, but not by everyone else. As the meeting continued, Emily's mind swirled. She had always been someone who prided herself on being diligent, on doing things by the book. But now, she wasn't sure how much of her past success mattered. The person she had once been, someone who had worked hard to carve out a place for herself, wasn't the person she needed to be in this new world. The days that followed the all-staff meeting felt like a series of tightrope walks for Emily. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere at the airline, the subtle tension that had replaced the easy familiarity she once took for granted. It wasn't just the fact that Dwayne Johnson had taken over the company. It was the feeling that everything, including her own position, was now up for evaluation. She tried to focus on her work, to keep her head down and her performance impeccable, but something inside her had changed. It was as if every interaction, every moment she spent on a flight, felt under a magnifying glass. Her colleagues, though not outwardly hostile, seemed to treat her with a little more caution. Some avoided eye contact, while others would pass by with quiet whispers. The whispers were the worst. They clung to her, their weight heavier than the bag of in-flight snacks she carried up and down the aisles. Megan, though still a friendly presence, had become more distant. Emily could see the concern in her eyes, but Megan was a seasoned professional. She knew how to navigate these kinds of situations. Maybe Emily wasn't quite as adept at it yet. Her nights were restless. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the moment when Dwayne had stood in front of her at the gate. She could still feel the coolness of the air around her, his unblinking gaze locked onto hers. His voice had been calm, too calm, but it had also been laced with something else, something that made her stomach twist. Did he know she was shaken? Could he tell how much she had felt the weight of her mistake? Despite his calm demeanor, she could sense that Dwayne wasn't as indifferent as he appeared. She had expected him to brush her off completely, to make it clear that she was just another nameless, faceless worker. But his words had stayed with her. He hadn't been dismissive. He hadn't used his power to crush her. Instead, he'd chosen to let it go. And that only made her more uneasy. Was he letting it go because it didn't matter to him? Or was there something more? Something deeper that she couldn't understand yet? It was a week after the meeting when Emily found herself back at the airport, preparing for another long-haul flight. She had tried to shake off the nagging feeling that the new ownership of the airline had shifted the dynamics of her job, but today, the unease was stronger than ever. As she stood by the gate, organizing her paperwork and mentally running through her pre-flight checklist, her phone buzzed. "Hey, Em, do you have a second?" Megan's text read. "Sure. What's up?" "Meet me in the break room. We need to talk." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd been half expecting a conversation like this. She knew that Megan had noticed the shift in her behavior, the way Emily seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She didn't want to have this conversation. Not here. Not now. But she knew it was inevitable. A few minutes later, Emily made her way to the break room, finding Megan sitting at a small table, sipping from a coffee cup. The usual hum of chatter was absent today. The room felt quieter than usual, like everyone was holding their breath. Megan glanced up as Emily entered. "Sit down," she said softly. "We need to talk." Emily sat down across from her, a mix of dread and anticipation building in her chest. "What's going on, Meg?" Megan set her cup down and folded her hands in front of her. She was serious now, her eyes locking onto Emily's. "I've been talking to a few people. Word's getting around, Em. About the incident." Emily winced. She didn't need Megan to remind her. She had been trying to forget it, trying to pretend it hadn't happened, but the reality of it kept creeping back. "I know," Emily said quietly, not meeting Megan's gaze. "It's just been a lot." Megan leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "You're not the first person to make a mistake with someone like him, and you won't be the last. But you need to realize something. Dwayne Johnson doesn't play by the rules everyone else does. He's not just some celebrity or rich businessman. He's a force, Em. And right now, no one knows what he's going to do next. He's changing the game, and we're all just trying to keep up." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of Megan's words. "I just don't know where I fit in anymore. It's like everything I've worked for is suddenly not enough." Megan's expression softened. "I get it. You've worked hard to get where you are. But you're not alone in this. I know things feel tense right now, but that doesn't mean you've lost everything. And it certainly doesn't mean you're out of place. You're good at your job, Emily. That's what matters." Emily managed a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm just not sure anymore. What if I mess up again? What if this whole thing, everything, falls apart because of me?" Megan took a deep breath, then reached across the table, resting her hand on Emily's. "Look, Mistakes happen. We all make them. But you can't keep living like this, constantly second-guessing yourself. You've got to trust yourself again, Em. And if you're really struggling with this, maybe it's time to talk to someone higher up. Don't let it fester. Talk to Dwayne. Tell him what happened. Get it off your chest. The only way out of this is to face it. Emily looked up at Megan, a spark of surprise in her eyes. You want me to talk to Dwayne? Megan gave a small, encouraging smile. Not many people get a chance to do that. You never know what might come of it. But one thing's for sure, you'll never know unless you try. Later that afternoon, as Emily was preparing to board her flight, she saw him again. Dwayne Johnson. He was standing by the gate, talking to a group of executives, his commanding presence unmistakable. His eyes flicked over to Emily as she walked past, and for a split second, their gazes locked. It was as if time slowed, and for that moment, she couldn't breathe. He didn't look angry or upset. He just looked neutral, maybe even slightly intrigued. But it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. Dwayne had no idea how much his presence in her life was weighing on her. The days following her conversation with Megan felt like a slow march toward an inevitable confrontation. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something big. The tension in the air had become almost unbearable, and as much as she tried to bury the anxiety bubbling inside her, she knew that she couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. She had to face Dwayne Johnson. As she prepared for her next flight, Emily could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was someone who had made a mistake in front of one of the most powerful men in the industry, and now she had to figure out how to make it right, or at least how to live with it. That afternoon, as she walked to the gate, she spotted him again. Dwayne Johnson. He was standing near the boarding area, speaking to one of the pilots. His size was even more imposing up close. The way he carried himself, the casual authority he exuded, it was almost as if he were built for this life, as if he had always been in control. Emily swallowed hard, her nerves getting the best of her. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, every step toward him making her more aware of the gulf between them. Megan's words echoed in her mind. If you're really struggling with this, maybe it's time to talk to someone higher up. Don't let it fester. Talk to Dwayne. Tell him what happened. Get it off your chest. But could she really do it? Could she confront him after everything? Could she even find the right words? As she neared the gate, she saw that Dwayne was now standing alone, his phone in his hand. Emily took a deep breath and made her way over, her footsteps slow but determined. She wasn't sure how this would go. All she knew was that it was time to take control of the situation. "Mr. Johnson?" she called out, her voice a little shakier than she intended. Dwayne looked up from his phone, his sharp gaze landing on her immediately. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Ms. Matthews," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "How's it going?" His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it that made her stomach twist. She could tell he remembered the incident. How could he not? It was probably one of the most bizarre interactions he'd had in a long time. I just wanted to apologize," Emily began, her voice trembling slightly. "For the other day, at the gate. I didn't mean to, I didn't intend for things to get awkward." Dwayne studied her for a moment, his expression still unreadable. For a brief second, Emily wondered if she had made a mistake even approaching him. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe it wasn't even on his radar anymore. But then he spoke. "I've been thinking about it, Emily." Her heart skipped a beat. "It was an unfortunate situation," he continued, "but I get it. I really do. You were just doing your job. I can't fault you for that." His words were calm, almost reassuring. Emily wasn't sure how to respond. It felt like a weight had been lifted, but also like something deeper had been left unsaid. "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page moving forward," Dwayne added. "We're a team, right? And in a team, things happen. But what matters is how we handle them." Emily nodded, still not entirely sure what he meant by that. "I understand. I just wanted to make sure you knew that I never intended to make things difficult." Dwayne gave a slight nod, then looked over her shoulder, as though something had caught his attention. "Look, I don't want you to stress about it. Just keep doing your job, and I'll make sure things don't get too tense between us. Okay. For a moment, Emily was caught off guard. She had expected something harsher, maybe even an ultimatum. But instead, Dwayne's words were surprisingly understanding. Okay, she replied softly, almost relieved. Thank you. She had crossed paths with Dwayne Johnson, and that moment had redefined her position in ways she couldn't fully grasp yet. The other crew members seemed to notice her calmer demeanor. Megan shot her a curious look during their break, but Emily just shrugged. There wasn't much to say. She had faced the music, and for now, that was enough. But as the flight went on, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. More to Dwayne Johnson. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but something told her that their paths would cross again. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. And when they did, she would need to be ready for whatever came next. The days following her conversation with Dwayne Johnson felt like a strange mix of relief and doubt. While part of her felt lighter, like she could breathe again, the other part, the part that had been anxiously waiting for the worst to happen, couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was looming. She had done what she could to patch things up, but there was still a nagging thought that lingered in the back of her mind. What if she wasn't enough? What if her mistake had already written her off in the eyes of everyone else at the company? Emily had always been someone who prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to get things done and maintain composure. But now, that confidence felt like a distant memory. The walls she had carefully built around her, the ones that kept her grounded in her role, had started to crack. She was no longer the same person who had climbed the ranks to become a lead flight attendant. She was someone who had made a mistake in front of a powerful man, someone who now had to live with the consequences. She was determined to not let it ruin her career, though. She'd faced challenges before, even more difficult ones, and had come out stronger. This time, she told herself, would be no different. It was late one evening when she was assigned to a late-night flight to New York. The airport was quieter than usual, with only a handful of flights left in the day. As she walked through the terminal, her phone buzzed with a message. Hey, Em. You've got a meeting at 10 a.m. tomorrow with the new exec team. They want to talk about a few things, including your recent incident. Don't worry. It'll be fine. It was from Megan. The message hit her like a punch to the gut. A meeting? She wasn't sure what to expect, but her stomach churned at the thought of having to face another round of scrutiny. She had just started to feel like the air was clearing, and now this? Emily sighed, stuffing her phone into her pocket. She didn't have time to think about it now. She had a flight to work, and it was business as usual. But the unease followed her onto the plane. Every moment she spent serving passengers felt like a blur. Her mind was on autopilot, but her heart was racing with the thought of what would happen the next day. The flight to New York was uneventful, and by the time Emily landed, her nerves had frayed even further. She couldn't sleep that night, tossing and turning in her hotel room. What could they possibly want to talk to her about? Was this a disciplinary meeting? Was she going to lose her job? She couldn't help but replay the moment she'd spoken to Dwayne again. Don't stress about it. Keep doing your job. We're all in this together. His words echoed in her head, but they felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who wasn't in her shoes. She sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling. The soft hum of the city outside her window did little to ease her mind. Her whole life had been about finding stability in the chaos, about making her way through life with a steady hand. But now, it felt like the ground beneath her feet was constantly shifting, like she was treading water in a sea of uncertainty. The next morning, Emily walked into the conference room, where the executive team was already gathered. The table was polished and immaculate, and the room itself was filled with sleek modern decor that made everything feel colder, more impersonal. There were 4 executives sitting around the table, all of them in business attire, all of them wearing expressions that were impossible to read. Then, at the far end of the table, stood Dwayne. He was standing, his arms crossed as he looked down at the agenda on the table in front of him. He wore a relaxed but authoritative air about him, his presence filling the room. His sharp eyes briefly flicked up to meet Emily's as she entered, and though his expression remained neutral, she could feel the weight of his gaze. "Emily," he said with a slight nod, gesturing toward an empty chair. Please, take a seat. She nodded and made her way to the chair, her heart racing as she sat down, trying to steady her breathing. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. But strangely, she didn't feel the overwhelming sense of fear she had expected. Instead, there was a sense of quiet anticipation in the air, a feeling that things were about to shift, whether she was ready for it or not. "Thank you for joining us today," one of the executives said, her voice crisp. She was the first to speak, and Emily immediately recognized her as someone who had been in the company for years. "We've reviewed your performance and the situation that arose during the last few flights. While it's clear that there was a misunderstanding, we do need to ensure that all crew members are adhering to the standards we expect." Emily braced herself for the criticism, but it never came. Instead, they spoke in vague terms, emphasizing policies and procedure. It wasn't until Dwayne spoke that Emily felt the full weight of the conversation. "You've been a solid performer, Emily," Dwayne said, his voice calm and controlled. "But there's one thing I want to make clear. Running an airline isn't just about following the rules. It's about knowing when to step up and be accountable, especially in situations where the pressure's high." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Was this his way of telling her she hadn't handled the situation properly? "Let's be clear," he continued, his gaze focused on her now, no longer distracted by the paperwork. "I don't blame you for what happened, but I do want to see you rise above it. Take ownership and make sure it doesn't define you. You're here because you're capable, and I want to see you prove that. Not just to me, but to yourself." Emily swallowed hard, her emotions swirling inside her. It wasn't what she had expected. It wasn't an attack, but an invitation. An invitation to prove herself, to grow, to learn. She nodded slowly, trying to process what he was saying. "I understand," she said, her voice steady now, the resolve growing within her. "I won't let it define me. I'll prove that I can do better." Dwayne's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the ice around him seemed to melt. "Good. I believe in second chances, Emily. Don't let this opportunity slip away." As the meeting wrapped up, Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear: Dwayne believed in her. It was a small thing, a simple gesture, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope in her. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, both personal and professional. But for the first time in days, Emily felt like she had the power to face whatever came her way. It had been a week since Emily's meeting with Dwayne Johnson and the executive team, and the sense of unease that had followed her for so long was starting to fade, replaced by something new: determination. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was in control again. The path ahead was still unclear, but she knew that she had the strength to navigate it. The morning after the meeting, Emily had woken up with a new sense of purpose. She knew she had to prove herself, not just to Dwayne, not just to the executives, but to herself. She couldn't afford to let fear or doubt dictate her actions any longer. She threw herself into her work with renewed focus. Whether it was ensuring her passengers' comfort or helping her fellow crew members, Emily made it a point to approach every task with an energy that had been missing before. Her colleagues began to notice. Her interactions with them were more positive, more confident, and they responded in kind. Even Megan seemed to notice the change, offering her a smile when they crossed paths in the break room one afternoon. "You're looking a lot more like yourself," Megan said, raising an eyebrow. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Emily smiled, though there was still a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to move on from all that other stuff." Megan nodded knowingly. "It's tough, but you've got this, Em. You're one of the best on this team, and people notice that." But it wasn't just about regaining the respect of her colleagues. It was about proving to herself that she was more than just the mistake she had made. She had to show that she could bounce back, that she had the resilience to keep going no matter how hard things got. It wasn't long before Emily's commitment began to pay off. She was given a new set of responsibilities, leading a few more flights and overseeing a larger group of crew members. The work wasn't easy, but it was rewarding. She could feel herself growing, not just as a flight attendant, but as a leader. One afternoon, after a particularly smooth flight to Los Angeles, Emily found herself sitting with one of the newer attendants, Laura, in the crew lounge. They'd spent the last few hours going over emergency procedures, and Emily had been surprised by how quickly Laura had picked up on things. "You're a natural," Emily told her, offering an encouraging smile. "You've got the skills. Just keep your confidence up, and you'll do great." Laura beamed, clearly grateful for the praise. "Thanks, Emily. Honestly, I've been nervous about keeping up with everyone, but you make it look easy." Emily laughed softly, though she couldn't deny the truth in Laura's words. A few months ago, she wouldn't have thought it was easy at all. But now? Now, it felt more natural. She'd spent so much time overthinking, second-guessing herself, and worrying about what others thought of her. But there was something about leading by example that gave her a new sense of peace. She was no longer concerned with impressing everyone around her. She was focused on simply doing the job the best she could, and in turn, her colleagues began to trust her more. They came to her for advice, for guidance, for reassurance. Emily felt like she was slowly reclaiming the role she had worked so hard for. Her confidence was still a work in progress, but each small victory was helping her rebuild the foundation she'd once taken for granted. One night, a few days later, after finishing up a flight, Emily found herself waiting in the airport lounge for her connecting flight. She was scrolling through her phone when she saw a notification pop up, a message from Dwayne Johnson. "Emily, I wanted to check in and see how things were going. Hope you're still feeling good about everything. I know it's been a rough few weeks, but I think you're really starting to find your footing. Keep up the good work." Her heart skipped a beat. For some reason, seeing a message from him made her feel both relieved and anxious. His words were simple, yet they carried weight. He was watching, paying attention, and believed in her progress. But there was still that nagging feeling, that uncertainty about whether she was truly worthy of his faith in her. She knew that nothing would change unless she took full ownership of her role in the company, something that had become even more clear after Dwayne's words during their meeting. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat back in her seat, letting the words sink in. Emily had spent so much of her life being afraid of failure, of making mistakes. But now, she saw things differently. Failure wasn't the end. It was simply part of the journey. What mattered was how she picked herself up and kept moving forward. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time, it was a text from Megan. "Hey, Em. Big news. We just got word that the company is launching a new initiative for employee leadership training. They want you to be part of it. I think it's a huge opportunity for you to take your career to the next level. You in?" Emily stared at the message, a mix of excitement and disbelief flooding her. Leadership training. The opportunity she'd been hoping for. She quickly typed a response, "Absolutely. Let's do this." As soon as she hit send, a wave of relief washed over her. This was it. This was her chance to really prove to everyone, and herself, that she had what it took to rise above it all. Later that evening, as Emily boarded her flight home, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she'd come in the past few weeks. There had been times when she doubted herself, when she questioned whether she could overcome the hurdles in front of her. But now, she was beginning to believe in her own strength. She wasn't the same person who had made a careless mistake in front of Dwayne Johnson. She was someone who had faced her fears, taken responsibility, and kept moving forward. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a while, Emily was genuinely excited for the future. The first day of the leadership training program felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Emily had spent most of her career as a flight attendant, honing her skills in customer service, safety procedures, and teamwork. But now, she was entering a new world. A world where her voice mattered more than ever, and her decisions could influence the success of an entire team. The training was held at the company's headquarters, a sleek modern building in the heart of the city. As Emily walked through the doors, she couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had always been good at her job, but now, she was being asked to lead others. Was she really ready for this? "Don't overthink it," she told herself, taking a deep breath. "You've got this." The training program was set up as a series of workshops, seminars, and group activities designed to sharpen leadership skills. The first session of the day was an introduction to conflict resolution, a topic that made Emily's stomach twist slightly. Conflict resolution. She had faced her own internal conflicts in the past few months, but this felt different. She wasn't just resolving issues between coworkers or dealing with a disgruntled passenger. She was learning how to manage the emotions and challenges of an entire team. As the facilitator, a confident woman named Laura began speaking. Emily tried to focus. Laura's presence was commanding. She knew exactly what she was talking about, and her experience was clear in every word she spoke. Conflict is inevitable in any workplace, Laura said, her voice steady and authoritative. But what defines a leader is how they handle that conflict. Do they step in and mediate? Do they foster an environment where solutions can be found? Emily took notes, trying to absorb as much as possible. She could already think of a few times when she had faced conflict with colleagues, misunderstandings that had been resolved with a few kind words or a calm discussion. But leading through conflict would require more than just diplomacy. It would require emotional intelligence, patience, and the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. That afternoon, they moved into a group exercise. Emily was assigned to a team with 3 other participants: Chris, a senior flight attendant; Lisa, a young, ambitious ground operations supervisor; and Mark, a captain who had been with the company for years. The task was straightforward enough: create a strategy for handling a potential emergency situation in which a passenger becomes violent mid-flight. At first, Emily felt a bit out of place. She was surrounded by people with more experience, people who had worked in various roles throughout the airline. But she quickly realized that her own experience as a flight attendant gave her a unique perspective. She understood the pressures the cabin crew faced in a crisis, the need for clear communication and a calm demeanor. It wasn't just about dealing with the angry passenger. It was about ensuring the safety of everyone on board. "So, Emily," Lisa said, glancing up from her notepad, "you've dealt with difficult passengers before, right? How would you approach this?" For a moment, Emily hesitated. She had never thought of herself as a natural leader. But now, with all eyes on her, it felt different. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for the team. She took a deep breath and began. "I think the most important thing in a situation like this is to stay calm," Emily said, her voice steady. "If we lose our cool, it only escalates the situation. I'd suggest starting with a soft approach. Try to de-escalate verbally. If that doesn't work, we need to make sure the rest of the passengers are safe and contained. But above all, we need to work as a team. The flight attendants, the pilots, the crew, we all need to be on the same page." The others nodded in agreement, and the discussion turned into a more detailed plan of action. Emily felt a spark of confidence. She wasn't just following orders now. She was part of the decision-making process. By the end of the exercise, the group had developed a solid strategy, and Emily found herself feeling more empowered than ever before. She had contributed meaningfully to the discussion, and her ideas had been well received. The next few days of training were just as intense. The workshops covered topics like team building, decision-making, and managing stress, all of which were crucial for Emily's growth as a leader. She had always been good at thinking on her feet, but now, she was learning how to apply those skills in a more structured way. But there was one topic that lingered in her mind: feedback. Giving and receiving feedback had always been difficult for Emily. She was someone who preferred to work quietly, behind the scenes, and the thought of confronting someone about their performance made her uneasy. On the final day of training, the group was asked to conduct a mock performance review. Emily was paired with Chris, the senior flight attendant. As the exercise began, she felt her heart race. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. "All right, Emily," Chris said with a smile. "Let's get started." "Right," Emily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She glanced at the feedback form in front of her, feeling the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. "So, Chris, I've been asked to give you feedback on your performance. You've been with the company for a long time, so I imagine you've got a lot of experience to share." Chris nodded, his expression open and patient. "I think one of your strengths is your experience," Emily continued, gaining confidence as she spoke. "You bring a lot of knowledge to the table, and I've noticed how you handle difficult situations with a calm demeanor. But there's one thing I think you could work on." For the next few minutes, Emily carefully offered constructive criticism, focusing on areas where Chris could improve. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. She wasn't attacking him. She was offering insights that could help him grow, just as she was trying to grow. When the exercise ended, Emily felt a sense of pride. She had done it. She had given feedback, and it hadn't been as terrifying as she had feared. That evening, after the training session had ended, Emily walked back to her hotel, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The past few days had pushed her beyond her comfort zone in ways she hadn't expected, but now, she could see the impact it had on her. She was learning to step into her role as a leader, and while the road ahead would be challenging, she was ready for it. As she walked into her room, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Dwayne Johnson. "I've been hearing great things about you, Emily. Keep up the good work. I knew you had it in you." Her heart swelled as she read the words. It wasn't just about doing her job anymore. It was about proving to herself and to the people around her that she was capable of more than she had ever thought possible. With a smile, Emily put her phone down and looked out the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The journey was just beginning, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was ready to take on whatever came next. Emily's first test as a leader came much sooner than she expected. It had been a few weeks since she completed the leadership training program, and she was starting to feel more comfortable in her new role. She had been assigned to lead a few more flights and, while still apprehensive, she felt more equipped than ever before. She had gained confidence in her ability to manage people, handle conflict, and make decisions under pressure. But nothing had prepared her for the turbulence that would come in the form of her first in-flight emergency as a lead attendant. It started like any other flight. Emily and her team were preparing for takeoff, performing the usual checks, ensuring that everything was in order for a smooth flight from Los Angeles to Chicago. The passengers settled into their seats, and Emily felt a sense of calm wash over her. This was her world. She could do this. But just over an hour into the flight, things started to go wrong. The first sign was a disturbance near the back of the plane. Emily had just finished speaking with a passenger in the forward cabin when a junior flight attendant, Rachel, came rushing toward her. "Emily, we've got a situation," Rachel said, her voice tense. "One of the passengers is refusing to follow instructions. He's been asked to return to his seat multiple times, but he's not listening. I think he's drunk." Emily's stomach sank. Her mind raced as she quickly assessed the situation. This wasn't just an annoyed passenger. This was a potential safety risk. "All right," Emily said, keeping her voice steady. "Let's head back there and handle this. We'll need to keep things calm. If he's intoxicated, we need to be extra careful." She led Rachel down the aisle, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew how important it was to stay calm in situations like this, but it wasn't always easy. As they reached the back of the plane, Emily spotted the man, a middle-aged passenger in a wrinkled suit, standing in the aisle, swaying slightly. His eyes were bloodshot, and his speech was slurred as he shouted at another passenger. "I told you, I'm not sitting down. What do you want me to do? Just sit here like a kid?" the man bellowed, completely ignoring the flight attendants around him. Emily took a deep breath. This was her moment. She couldn't let panic take over. She needed to de-escalate this situation before it got worse. "Sir," she said, approaching him slowly but with authority, "I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. We're experiencing some turbulence, and for your safety, it's important that you follow the instructions of the crew." The man turned to face her, his gaze unfocused, and he let out a scoff. "You can't tell me what to do. I paid for this ticket, didn't I?" Emily didn't flinch. She had been trained for moments like this. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a leader, and she had to take charge. "Sir, I understand you're frustrated, but this is a matter of safety. I'm asking you one more time to please sit down. If you don't, I may need to involve the captain." The man's face flushed red, and for a moment, Emily thought he might lash out. But just as quickly, he staggered back toward his seat. "Fine, whatever." Emily didn't relax just yet. She stood at the back of the cabin for a moment, watching him, before giving Rachel a nod. "Good job," Emily said, her voice calm. "Let's keep an eye on him for the rest of the flight." As the situation de-escalated, Emily's adrenaline started to subside, but her mind was still racing. That was the first real test of her leadership abilities, and she had passed. The rest of the flight went smoothly, with no further disturbances from the passenger. After landing, Emily sat down in the crew lounge, taking a deep breath. The relief was palpable, but so was the realization that leadership was not just about handling the easy situations. It was about managing the difficult ones, too. The following week, Emily was given another opportunity to test her skills. This time, it was a routine flight from New York to Miami, but she had no idea that it would push her to her limits once again. The flight was halfway through when one of the passengers in the middle section of the cabin began to experience a medical emergency. She started clutching her chest and gasping for breath, and the woman next to her screamed for help. Emily jumped into action, signaling for the nearest flight attendants to assist. As she moved quickly toward the scene, she could hear the passengers murmuring in panic. It was one of those moments where everything seemed to slow down, and Emily could feel the weight of the responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had been trained for medical emergencies. There were protocols for this, and she knew exactly what to do. But the pressure was real. This wasn't just a drill. This was someone's life on the line. "Rachel, get the defibrillator," Emily commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to keep her calm. Everyone else, please return to your seats." She bent down beside the woman, trying to remain calm for her. "Ma'am, we're here to help. You're going to be okay. Just breathe with me, all right?" The woman's face was pale, and her breath came in ragged gasps, but Emily kept talking to her, softly, reassuringly, while Rachel prepared the medical equipment. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, but Emily never let her focus slip. She stayed by the woman's side, offering words of comfort, while the team worked in sync to assess the situation and ensure the passenger's safety. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, the woman's breathing began to stabilize. By the time they landed in Miami, she was alert and conscious again, though still shaken. As the plane touched down, Emily felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. But she couldn't let herself slow down just yet. The most important thing was that the passenger was safe, and the team had done its job. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she reflected on the events of the past few days. She had faced two major challenges, both of which had tested her leadership abilities in ways she hadn't expected. But in each case, she had kept her cool. She had made decisions under pressure. She had kept her team on track. And most importantly, she had learned something crucial. Leadership wasn't just about being in charge. It was about taking responsibility, making difficult decisions, and never losing sight of the bigger picture, even when things seemed impossible. As Emily closed her eyes, she knew she was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a leader in every sense of the word, and she was only just beginning to understand what that really meant. Emily had always been a team player. She'd spent her career as a flight attendant, working closely with colleagues to ensure that passengers had a safe and pleasant journey. Now, as a leader, the dynamics were shifting in ways she hadn't expected. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. She had handled emergencies, solved conflicts, and grown in ways she hadn't imagined. But there was something she hadn't anticipated. The strain leadership would put on her personal relationships with her colleagues. It started innocently enough. Emily had always gotten along well with her fellow flight attendants, but since taking on the role of lead attendant, things felt different. The friendly banter that used to flow easily between her and the crew now felt awkward. There was a new distance between them, a barrier that hadn't been there before, and it was unsettling. One morning, during a pre-flight briefing, Emily noticed Rachel, one of the flight attendants she'd worked with for years, shooting her a glance as she checked in. Rachel, normally so cheerful, seemed distant, almost resentful. "Hey, Rachel," Emily said as the crew was preparing to board the plane. "How's everything going?" Rachel smiled weakly but didn't meet her eyes. "It's going fine. You know, just the usual." Emily didn't want to pry too much, but she could feel the tension between them. She had heard whispers from other crew members that Rachel was struggling with Emily's new role as the lead. Some of them thought she was too hard on them. Others thought she was overstepping, and it was starting to get to her. As the day wore on, Emily tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but the unease between her and Rachel only grew. Every instruction Emily gave was met with a short nod, and Rachel's usual enthusiasm seemed to have faded. The flight went smoothly, And once they had landed in Chicago, Emily decided to take the first step toward addressing the tension. She found Rachel standing by the galley, preparing to close up for the night. "Hey, can we talk for a minute?" Emily asked, her voice tentative but firm. Rachel looked up, surprised but not exactly thrilled. "Yeah, sure. What's up?" "Listen, I've noticed you've been a little distant lately," Emily began, trying to keep her tone casual. "I know things have changed since I've taken on this leadership role, and I just want to make sure everything's okay between us." Rachel hesitated, glancing down at the tray she was holding before setting it down and meeting Emily's eyes. "It's not that anything's wrong, exactly. I don't know, Em. It's hard, you know? It's different now." Emily's stomach tightened. She hadn't realized just how much her promotion had affected her team. "Different how?" Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "It's like, we used to be equals, right? We were a team. But now it feels like you're in charge of us. I get it. You're the lead, but I guess I didn't expect it to feel like this. Like there's this distance now. You're not one of us anymore." Emily took a deep breath. She had suspected this, but hearing Rachel say it out loud made her realize just how much her role had changed the dynamics. "I'm still the same person, Rachel," Emily said softly. "I'm not trying to be distant, but I can't ignore that things have changed. I need to lead, and that means making some tough calls." Rachel sighed. "I know. It's just hard when we've always been so close. I don't know how to act around you anymore." Emily felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had always valued her relationships with her colleagues, and now it felt like she was losing something important. "I don't want to lose our friendship," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I also need to do my job, and sometimes that means making decisions that might not be popular." Rachel nodded, her expression softening. "I get that. I guess I'm still trying to adjust." "We all are," Emily replied, offering a small smile. "But we'll figure it out. I don't want you to feel like I'm not part of the team anymore. You're all still my team, and I want us to work together." For a moment, Rachel just stood there, silently processing what Emily had said. Then, with a small nod, she smiled back. "Thanks, Em. I appreciate you saying that. I think I just needed to hear it." Emily felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a start. She could already feel the tension between them begin to ease. As the weeks passed, Emily continued to navigate the delicate balance between leadership and friendship. It wasn't always easy. She had to make decisions that her colleagues didn't always agree with, and sometimes those decisions created friction. But Emily was learning that leadership wasn't just about being the authority figure. It was about maintaining respect and fostering an environment where everyone felt heard and valued. One evening, after another long flight, Emily found herself in the crew lounge again, going over her notes for the next day. She had just returned from a particularly stressful flight, and her body ached from the constant movement and pressure. Her thoughts kept drifting back to her conversation with Rachel and to the challenge of leading a team that used to be her peers. "Everything okay?" a voice interrupted her thoughts. Emily looked up to see Chris, the senior flight attendant, standing by the door of the lounge. Chris had been a steady presence on the team since the beginning, and she had always appreciated his calm demeanor. "Yeah," Emily said, managing a tired smile, "just thinking about how to make all of this work." Chris took a seat across from her, studying her for a moment. "It's a lot, isn't it? Leadership, I mean, it's not just about making sure everything runs smoothly. It's about keeping the peace, too. Between you and the crew. I can see it's been weighing on you." Emily nodded, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. "It's harder than I thought. I never realized how much I'd have to balance. It's like walking a tightrope all the time." Chris smiled gently. "You're doing better than you think. You're handling it. The crew respects you, even if it doesn't always show. Just remember to give yourself some grace." "I'm trying," Emily said, exhaling deeply. I'm not sure where I fit anymore. I used to just do my job. Now, it feels like I'm responsible for everyone's job, too." "It's not an easy transition," Chris agreed, "but it's one you're making, and that counts for something." Emily smiled, feeling a bit lighter. "Thanks, Chris. That means a lot." "Anytime," Chris replied, standing up. You're doing great, Em. Keep at it. As the days wore on, Emily started to feel more confident in her role. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, but she was learning. And more than that, she was growing. She'd weathered emergencies, handled difficult passengers, and navigated the delicate balance of leadership. Yet, deep down, Emily knew that every day presented new opportunities for growth, and more tests would come her way. One of those tests came on a rainy Tuesday morning. The flight was a long one, from Miami to New York, with a full load of passengers and a forecast that promised turbulence. As usual, Emily prepared herself and her team. She went over safety procedures, made sure the crew was aligned on their duties, and ensured every passenger was settled. But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her stomach. Something about today felt different, and she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The first signs of trouble came early in the flight. Around 30 minutes into the journey, a passenger in the rear of the plane started complaining of severe abdominal pain. At first, Emily assumed it was just another case of air sickness, but the pain wasn't letting up. The woman's face had turned pale, and she was clutching her stomach with both hands, wincing in pain. Emily, I think this might be more serious than we thought, Rachel said, her voice laced with concern as she approached Emily in the galley. Emily nodded, her professional instincts kicking in. Let's get her checked out by the medical team. We'll make sure she's comfortable. They went to the woman's seat, and Emily knelt beside her. Ma'am, we're going to get you some help. Just hang in there. We're going to take care of you. But the woman's condition worsened quickly. Her breathing became shallow, and she began to break into a cold sweat. The other passengers were starting to notice, and whispers spread like wildfire through the cabin. Emily could feel the anxiety in the air, and it only made her more determined to act. Rachel, get the first aid kit, and let's call the captain. We might need to divert. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she worked with Rachel to stabilize the woman. They administered oxygen and did their best to keep her calm while they awaited further instructions. In the meantime, the captain informed them that they had just crossed into an area where turbulence was expected to intensify. Emily knew that they had a limited amount of time before things got worse. We need to make a decision, Emily said, her voice steady but urgent. I'll speak to the captain, but we may need to make an emergency landing. It's better to be safe than sorry. Rachel's eyes widened. But the weather's getting worse, Emily. If we divert now, we might run into even more turbulence. Are you sure? I don't think we have a choice, Emily replied, locking eyes with her. We can't risk it. As Emily made the call to the captain, the flight attendants sprang into action. Rachel and a few others worked to clear the aisles, and Emily made announcements to the passengers, trying to keep them informed without alarming them. She could feel the tension rising as the turbulence started to hit, but she kept her focus. The decision was made. The plane would divert to a nearby airport in Charlotte, North Carolina. Emily worked with the captain and her team to prepare the cabin for the emergency landing. The storm outside only added to the sense of urgency as the plane rocked from side to side, and Emily's nerves began to tingle with the weight of responsibility. She walked up and down the aisles, checking on passengers, reassuring them, and making sure everyone was secure. The crew worked seamlessly under her guidance. For a moment, Emily felt the full weight of leadership. The lives of everyone on board rested in her hands. The pressure was unlike anything she'd ever felt, but she couldn't afford to let it show. As the plane touched down in Charlotte, Emily's heart was in her throat. The landing was smooth, though it felt like an eternity. Once the plane was safely on the ground, Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The crew remained calm as they disembarked, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling of exhaustion and relief. The woman who had been in pain was taken off the plane by medical personnel, and the situation was under control. Yet, Emily couldn't ignore the deep sense of responsibility that weighed on her. Her decision had been the right one, but the stakes had never felt higher. The moment she stepped off the plane, she was greeted by the rest of the crew, all of them offering words of support. "Great job, Emily," Rachel said, her voice warm. "That was a tough call, but you handled it perfectly." Emily smiled, though she was still processing everything that had happened. "Thanks. I couldn't have done it without all of you." Chris, one of the senior attendants, gave her a nod of approval. You did good, Em. This is why you're the lead. But even with the praise, Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation linger. It wasn't just about keeping things together in the moment. It was about knowing that every decision she made could have serious consequences. She couldn't take that responsibility lightly. Later that night, as Emily lay in her hotel room, she found herself reflecting on the events of the day. The woman's condition, the pressure to make the right choice, the tension in the cabin. It had all been overwhelming, but it had also been a wake-up call. Leadership wasn't just about managing tasks or delegating authority. It was about making the hard decisions when they mattered most. It was about trusting your instincts, even when the stakes were high. Emily had done that today. She had made the right call, and it had saved lives. But that didn't mean it had been easy. The next morning, Emily sat down for breakfast with the crew in the hotel lobby. As she sipped her coffee, she realized that the true test of leadership wasn't just handling crises. It was how you carried yourself afterward. The ability to learn, to reflect, and to share those lessons with others was what made a leader truly great. Rachel sat across from her, offering a smile. You really pulled us through yesterday. I don't think we could have done it without you. Emily smiled back, grateful for the acknowledgement. I'm just glad we made the right decision. That's all that matters. But inside, Emily knew something deeper had changed. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a leader, not just in title, but in her ability to make tough decisions and lead her team with confidence. And, most importantly, she was starting to believe in herself. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days after the emergency landing in Charlotte felt like a blur. Emily's mind was still processing the adrenaline of the decision she had made, the weight of responsibility that came with leadership. Though the crew had praised her, there was a nagging feeling in her chest, an unsettling sense of self-doubt. Had she done everything right? Was she truly cut out for this role, or was she just lucky? The truth was, Emily wasn't sure. As the next few weeks passed, Emily's leadership was tested again and again. While she continued to handle the job with the same diligence, there was something missing. Her confidence had taken a hit, and the small cracks in her armor were beginning to show. In the midst of all the pressure, Emily found herself grappling with her own limits. For the first time, she felt the weight of her decisions not just on her shoulders, but deep within her heart. Each new challenge felt harder than the last. Every decision seemed to be a test. Every misstep felt like it could be her last. One quiet afternoon, Emily sat in the crew lounge during a layover in Atlanta, scrolling through her phone, trying to distract herself from the spiraling thoughts in her head. She'd been reading articles about leadership, about how to build trust, how to communicate better with her team, how to keep the crew engaged. But the more she read, the more overwhelmed she felt. Am I doing any of this right? She asked herself aloud, not expecting an answer. Doing what right? Came a voice from behind her. Emily looked up to see Rachel, who had appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee in hand. Emily managed a weak smile, trying to push away the sense of vulnerability that had been creeping up on her lately. Just everything, Emily replied, her tone filled with frustration. It feels like I'm constantly second-guessing myself. I don't know if I'm leading the way I should be, if I'm making the right choices for the team. Rachel took a seat across from Emily and set down her coffee. There was a quiet understanding in her eyes, one that only a teammate of Emily's could share. Em, you've been doing this longer than most of us. I know it's tough, but you've got this, Rachel said gently, her voice calm. Leadership's not about being perfect. It's about making the best decision with the information you have, and you're doing that. You always have. Emily wanted to believe her, but the doubts continued to gnaw at her. But what if I make the wrong decision? What if I let someone down? Hey, Rachel said, her voice firm. You're never going to get everything right all the time. But I've seen you handle some of the toughest situations, and you never quit. You never give up on us, and we all see that. We trust you. Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. The weight of Rachel's words hit her harder than she expected. Trust. It was something she had worked hard to build, but lately, it was hard to feel like she was living up to it. She couldn't afford to let the team down, not when everything was on the line. I don't want to be that leader who's too hard or too soft, Emily admitted. I don't want to alienate anyone, but I also don't want to let things slide. Rachel smiled slightly. That's the thing about leadership. It's not about getting it perfect. It's about being there for your team and knowing that even when you mess up, they've got your back. Emily nodded, appreciating the sentiment, though she still felt a tight knot in her chest. There was no way around the self-doubt she was feeling. But Rachel's words planted a seed of reassurance, and for the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe she was on the right track. Later that evening, after the crew finished their duties for the day, Emily found herself sitting alone on a park bench outside the hotel. The Atlanta skyline loomed in the distance, and the city buzzed with the sounds of evening traffic. It was the rare moment of peace that Emily had been craving. She closed her eyes, letting the cool evening air wash over her. The gentle breeze seemed to carry away some of the weight she had been carrying around. She could still hear Rachel's words in her head. It's not about being perfect. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe Emily didn't have to have all the answers all the time. Maybe she just needed to keep trying, keep learning, and trust that she was doing the best she could. Emily smiled to herself, realizing something important. Leadership wasn't about being flawless. It was about being honest, being there for the people who relied on her, and finding the courage to make the tough decisions, even when those decisions didn't feel easy. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Chris walking toward her. "You look like you're deep in thought," Chris remarked, taking a seat next to her. Emily smiled. "Just thinking about everything. You know, the usual." Chris raised an eyebrow but didn't push. He sat quietly beside her for a moment before speaking again. "You've been handling things really well, Em. I've seen a lot of leaders come and go, and you're handling everything with more grace than I expected," Chris said, his voice genuine. Emily felt a warm rush of gratitude at his words. "I don't know, Chris. Lately, I've just been feeling like I'm not doing enough. Like I'm letting people down." Chris chuckled softly. "That's exactly what I mean. You care too much. But that's what makes you good at this. You might not always feel like you're on top of things, but the fact that you care enough to worry about it is what makes you a great leader." Emily shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "I think you might be overestimating me." "No, I'm being honest. I've seen you grow into this role, and you're doing a hell of a job. Sometimes, leadership isn't about getting everything right. It's about showing up and making the tough calls when they matter." The next morning, Emily boarded the flight with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that her journey as a leader would be full of highs and lows, moments of triumph and moments of doubt. But she had something important now: perspective. It wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, doing her best, and trusting her team to be there when she needed them most. As the plane ascended into the skies, Emily looked out the window, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over her. There would always be challenges ahead, but she was ready. She was learning, she was growing, and that was enough. It was a calm Thursday morning when Emily and her team were preparing for another long flight. The crew had gathered in the briefing room for their usual pre-flight meeting. There was a sense of quiet camaraderie in the air. Everyone was in good spirits, and the weather was perfect for the journey ahead. But underneath the surface, Emily could feel an undercurrent of tension. It wasn't something anyone had said aloud, but there was a noticeable shift in the way the crew was interacting with one another. Conversations seemed shorter, glances a little colder. Emily could sense that something was off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As the lead flight attendant, it was her job to maintain harmony within the team, and she couldn't ignore the fact that this subtle change in atmosphere was making her uneasy. When the meeting concluded and the team dispersed to begin their respective tasks, Emily noticed that Rachel, usually one of her most reliable and open colleagues, seemed distant. She was busy preparing the galley, but there was an air of avoidance in the way she moved. Emily had worked with Rachel long enough to know when something was wrong, and this felt like one of those times. Later, while they were preparing the cabin, Emily approached Rachel, who was carefully securing the drink cart. "Hey, Rachel, can we talk for a minute?" Emily asked, her tone gentle but firm. Rachel paused, her eyes flicking briefly to Emily before she nodded. "Sure. What's up?" "I've noticed a little tension today. Between the crew. I mean, Emily said, trying to keep her voice casual. I just want to make sure everything's okay. If there's something bothering you, I want to help. Rachel hesitated for a moment, and Emily could see the walls go up. It wasn't like Rachel to hold back, but something was definitely eating at her. I'm fine, Emily, Rachel replied, not quite meeting her gaze. It's just, I don't know. Maybe I'm just tired. Long flights, you know? Emily wasn't convinced, but she didn't push it further. Instead, she decided to observe the dynamics more closely. She learned that some issues took time to surface, and if she forced the conversation too quickly, it could backfire. So, she focused on leading the team through the rest of the flight. The flight went smoothly, but the tension lingered. By the time they landed, Emily was more certain than ever that something was wrong. She had always prided herself on her ability to read people, and right now, Rachel's behavior didn't sit right with her. After the passengers had disembarked, Emily gathered the crew together in the back of the plane for a debrief. She was determined to address the issue head-on, even if it was uncomfortable. All right, team, Emily began, her voice clear. Before we head off to the hotel, I just want to take a moment to check in with everyone. We've been flying together for a while now, and I know we've got a great team dynamic, but I've sensed a little bit of tension today. I want to make sure we're all good. If there's anything anyone needs to talk about, now's the time. For a brief moment, the room was silent. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable. Emily's eyes flicked over her team. Rachel was standing at the back, arms crossed, not looking at anyone. Chris was studying his shoes, and the others shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice quieter than usual. Emily, I don't think you're doing anything wrong, Rachel began, her words measured. But I think there's been a lot of pressure lately. We've all been working hard, and sometimes it feels like maybe you're expecting a bit too much from us. Emily's heart sank, but she stayed calm. This was the moment she'd been dreading, but also the moment that could ultimately help her grow as a leader. She had to listen. I'm not asking anyone to do more than they're capable of, Emily replied, her voice steady. But I know that sometimes I might push too hard. If that's the case, I'm really sorry. I just want us to do our best, and I know that means we all have to give a little more. But if I've been pushing too much, I need to know. I don't want anyone to feel overwhelmed. Rachel shook her head slightly. It's not that we don't want to give our best. It's just, we're all human. There are days when we're exhausted, when things don't go as planned. And sometimes, it feels like you don't see that. It's like you're always pushing forward, like you don't understand how much we're carrying. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't realized the extent to which her relentless drive had been affecting her team. She prided herself on being a strong, reliable leader, but she had neglected to recognize the signs of burnout in her crew. I didn't realize. I'm sorry, Rachel. I'll do better, Emily said, her voice softening. I just want to make sure we all succeed together. But I hear you. And I promise I'll try to be more mindful of the pressure I'm putting on everyone. Rachel nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. I know you care, Emily. We all do. We just need to communicate better, you know? Later that evening, as Emily sat in her hotel room, she reflected on the conversation. The realization hit her like a wave. Leadership wasn't just about directing the team or getting the best results. It was about understanding the needs of the people around her. It was about balance. Emily realized that she had been so focused on pushing her team to perform at the highest level that she hadn't stopped to check in with them on a personal level. She hadn't recognized the signs of fatigue, the need for rest, or the importance of stepping back to breathe. The next morning, Emily made a point to gather her crew before the flight. She looked each of them in the eye, making sure to connect with them on a personal level. I just want to thank you all for the hard work you've been putting in, Emily said. I know the last few weeks have been tough, and I appreciate all the dedication you've shown. But moving forward, I want us to remember that we're a team. We all have to look out for each other, not just in the air, but on the ground too. If anyone's feeling overwhelmed, let me know. We'll get through this together. The crew seemed relieved by her words, and Emily could see a change in their demeanor. The tension had lifted, and the team seemed more connected than ever. For the first time in a while, Emily felt like she was getting the balance right. Leadership wasn't about being perfect. It was about adapting, listening, and learning from the people around her. And today, Emily knew she was on the right path. It was the kind of day Emily usually loved. The sky clear, the plane ready, and a smooth flight ahead. But as they boarded the aircraft for yet another cross-country route, Emily could sense a shift in the usual rhythm of the crew. The atmosphere was a bit more serious than usual, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She noticed Chris was unusually quiet, his shoulders tense, and Rachel, though appearing fine on the surface, seemed a bit distracted. Emily had been doing her best to check in with the crew regularly, but something in the air told her that today would be different. As they reached cruising altitude, Emily made her usual rounds through the cabin. Her mind wandered back to the conversation she'd had with Rachel a few days ago, about pressure, about balance, and the importance of making sure everyone felt supported. She had meant what she said, and she had noticed an improvement in her team's morale. But still, the lingering sense of unease in the cabin was hard to ignore. When she reached the galley, she found Chris talking quietly with Rachel. Their conversation stopped the moment she entered, and Emily could sense the awkwardness. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, leaning against the doorframe. Chris gave a tight smile. "Yeah, all good. Just making sure everything's running smoothly." But Emily could tell there was more to it than that. She wasn't about to push it, at least, not yet. She had learned the hard way that some things were better addressed when the timing felt right. It wasn't until later in the flight that the situation took a sudden turn. The intercom crackled, and the voice of a passenger echoed through the cabin. It was a woman, but there was something in her tone that immediately put Emily on high alert. "Excuse me, I'd like to speak to the captain," the woman's voice said, sharp and demanding. Emily furrowed her brow. "I'll be right there," she said, pressing the button to speak to the cockpit crew. She knew that when passengers requested to speak directly to the captain, it wasn't usually a simple matter. She made her way to the front of the plane, where the woman was now standing. Emily could see that she was visibly upset, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" Emily asked, her tone calm but professional. The woman looked her up and down before speaking. "Yes, I'm not happy with the service. I've been waiting for over 15 minutes for my drink order, and now the cabin is noisy. This is supposed to be a first-class experience, and this," she gestured around the cabin, "is not what I paid for." Emily took a deep breath, keeping her voice steady. "I'm so sorry for the delay, ma'am. I understand your frustration. I'll get your drink order right away and make sure the crew is aware of the noise level. Please let me know if there's anything else I can do to assist you." But the woman wasn't finished. She was clearly displeased, and Emily could see her getting more agitated by the second. "No, that's not good enough," the woman snapped. "I demand to speak to the person in charge. Who is running this operation?" Emily didn't flinch. "I'm the lead flight attendant, ma'am. I'll make sure you're taken care of." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You're in charge? Well, I don't think you're doing a very good job of it." Emily's patience was starting to wear thin. She had handled difficult passengers before, but something about this woman's attitude struck a nerve. She was used to managing high-pressure situations, but this was different. The passenger's tone felt personal, like she was undermining Emily's authority. "Ma'am, I assure you, I will do everything I can to resolve this situation to your satisfaction," Emily said, her voice firm but polite. As Emily returned to the galley to get the woman's drink order, she could feel her pulse quicken. She had been a flight attendant for years, but she had never encountered a passenger who had so quickly questioned her ability to lead. The tension between them lingered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. Rachel and Chris were both nearby, working quietly. Emily turned to them. "Hey, I need you to keep an eye on the cabin. We've got an unhappy passenger, and I want to make sure things don't get out of hand." Rachel, ever the professional, nodded. "Got it, Em. We've got your back." The flight continued, but the atmosphere was tense. The woman's complaints had escalated to a point where Emily had to involve the captain, who had reassured the passenger that the issue would be addressed. But that didn't stop the woman from continuing to press Emily and the crew. Throughout the rest of the flight, Emily found herself walking a fine line between being polite and firm, trying to maintain control of the situation without letting the passengers' behavior derail the rest of the crew's performance. It was a delicate balance. Too much leniency and the passenger would continue to make unreasonable demands. Too much authority, and the situation would likely escalate further. Finally, as the flight began its descent, Emily felt a shift in the atmosphere. The passenger had settled down, her complaints having been acknowledged by both the crew and the captain. Emily's shoulders relaxed for the first time in hours, but the sense of unease lingered. Once the plane was on the ground and the passengers disembarked, Emily gathered the crew together in the briefing room. There was no denying the tension that had filled the cabin, and she wanted to make sure everyone felt heard. "Good job, team," Emily started, her voice steady. "I know that wasn't an easy situation, but we handled it together. I want to hear from you. How do you think things went?" Chris was the first to speak. "I think you did great, Emily. You stayed calm even when things got heated." "That's not easy." Rachel nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you kept your composure. It could have gone a lot worse." Emily let out a breath, feeling the weight of the day finally lifting. "Thanks, both of you. But I've been thinking. I could have communicated with the passenger better, been more clear about what we could do. And I could have asked for more support from the captain earlier." Chris smiled, but his tone was serious. "It's not always about getting everything perfect. You handled it as best you could, and we all got through it. That's what matters." Rachel added, "Exactly. And you didn't back down, which is important. You set a good example for the rest of us." As Emily walked back to her hotel that evening, she reflected on the challenge of the day. It had tested everything she had been working on: her communication skills, her ability to stay calm under pressure, and her understanding of her team's strengths. That day, Emily had learned another valuable lesson. Sometimes, leadership wasn't about solving every problem immediately. It was about navigating through conflict with patience and clarity, while knowing when to lean on the strength of her team. It was another routine flight from New York to Los Angeles, but the crew had a sense of weariness in their eyes as they boarded the plane. Emily noticed it the moment she walked into the briefing room. The faces of her team were a little more tired, a little more stressed than usual. The rigors of constant flying, late nights, and long hours were starting to take their toll. Emily herself had been feeling the weight of it all, too. But today wasn't about her. Today, she had to focus on her team. They all had a job to do, and she was there to support them, even if she was feeling the strain as well. The flight began smoothly. The first few hours were routine, checking on passengers, making sure the galley was stocked, and keeping the cabin in order. But as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, a message came over the intercom from the cockpit. A mechanical issue had been detected, and the flight would need to be diverted to a nearby airport for an emergency landing. Emily's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a major emergency, but anytime a plane had to divert for any reason, it created a ripple of anxiety. She immediately turned to Chris, her most seasoned crew member. "Chris, get ready for an announcement. We need to inform the passengers, but let's keep it calm. No reason to alarm them unnecessarily," she said, her voice steady. Chris nodded, but Emily could see the concern in his eyes. He'd been through emergency landings before, but the uncertainty of this particular situation made him cautious. Emily made her way to the front of the cabin, preparing to address the passengers. As she approached the galley, Rachel came up to her, her face pale. I just saw something," Rachel whispered urgently. "A passenger in first class. He's been drinking a lot. Too much. I don't think he's in a state to handle this situation well." Emily furrowed her brow. The last thing she needed was a passenger becoming disruptive during an emergency situation. "Where is he now?" Emily asked, her tone serious. "Still in his seat," Rachel said. "But he's slurring his words, and I think he's hiding something under his jacket." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "I'll take care of it. Thanks for letting me know." Emily moved swiftly to first class, her mind racing. She could see the man Rachel had mentioned, a middle-aged passenger, disheveled, with a nearly empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. His eyes were glazed, and his posture slumped. He hadn't noticed her approaching. "Sir, can I help you with something?" Emily asked, keeping her voice calm but firm. The man looked up, his face a mix of surprise and annoyance. "What do you want?" he slurred. "I'm fine. I'm just checking on you, sir. We've had a minor mechanical issue, and I want to make sure you're comfortable and prepared," Emily said, trying to steer the conversation toward neutral ground. She could smell the alcohol on his breath and saw that his hands were shaking slightly. I don't need anything from you. Just leave me alone, the man muttered. Emily knew she couldn't let this go. She had to make sure he wasn't a danger to himself or others, especially with the situation growing more tense due to the emergency landing. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to put your seatbelt on, she said, trying to assert her authority. We need everyone to follow safety protocol for the landing. Please, for your own safety, fasten your seatbelt. The man grumbled, but he didn't move. Emily's instincts told her that she had to act quickly. If this situation escalated, it could lead to chaos in the cabin. As she stepped back to assess the situation, she noticed a flicker of movement near the back of first class. A stewardess from another airline had boarded the flight as a passenger, and she had been watching Emily with an uncomfortable expression. Emily hesitated for a moment before making a decision. She needed to follow procedure, and her team had to be supported in these high-pressure situations. But the decision wasn't as clear-cut as it had seemed. She turned to Rachel, who had followed her down the aisle. Rachel, call the cockpit. We need to make sure the crew knows about this situation. We're going to need support if this passenger becomes a problem. Rachel nodded, her eyes wide with concern. Got it, Em. As Rachel made the call, Emily turned her attention back to the passenger. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave your seat and follow me. We need to move you to a more secure area for your own safety. To her surprise, the man stood up, his face turning red. Are you accusing me of something? You don't know who I am. I'll have your job for this. His voice was slurred, but loud enough to attract attention. Emily's heart raced. She'd encountered rude passengers before, but this was different. She could see the tension in the cabin growing, and the last thing she wanted was for this man's outburst to create panic. She had to manage the situation carefully. Sir, please lower your voice. You need to remain calm, Emily said, her voice now more authoritative. If you don't cooperate, I will have to involve security when we land. The man sneered at her. You think you can intimidate me? I'm not going anywhere. You're making a mistake. Emily knew she couldn't back down. Her responsibility to the safety of the crew and passengers was her priority. With a deep breath, she said, Sir, I'm giving you one last chance to cooperate. If you don't, I will need to restrain you for your own safety. The man hesitated, staring at her with a mix of anger and disbelief. But something in her voice must have made him reconsider, as he slumped back into his seat, glaring at Emily. I'll sit down, he muttered, his voice a threat. Emily nodded, but didn't take her eyes off him. She signaled for Chris and Rachel to assist, both of whom were already watching the situation closely. When the plane made its emergency landing and the passengers safely deplaned, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. The crisis had been averted, but the emotional toll of the situation had left her shaken. She had followed procedure, but it had been a close call. Later, as she debriefed with her team, Emily realized the true cost of leadership. Sometimes, it wasn't about making the easy decisions or going with the flow. It was about making the hard calls when the stakes were high. In this instance, she had been tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. Thanks for your support, team, Emily said as she gathered everyone together in the briefing room. We handled that better than I could have imagined. I know it wasn't easy, but we kept our composure. I'm proud of you all. Rachel smiled, her voice filled with pride. You handled it, Emily. You did what had to be done. It had been one of those days. Emily had dealt with more passenger complaints than she could count, assisted in a minor medical emergency, and had just managed to defuse a tense situation in the galley. By the time they were preparing to land in Miami, Emily was exhausted, both physically and mentally. Yet, something felt off. It wasn't just the stress of the day. It was the nagging feeling that something more was looming. As Emily made her rounds through the cabin, checking on passengers and ensuring that the seatbelt sign was on, she spotted something unexpected. A group of passengers in the back row of economy class were speaking in hushed tones, clearly agitated. One of them was looking at Emily with a serious expression. She approached the group, her instincts kicking in. Is everything okay back here? Emily asked, her tone calm but firm. One of the passengers, a man in his 40s, stood up and addressed her. We need to talk. I don't think it's safe for us to land in Miami. The weather's bad, and there's no need to take such a risk. We'd be better off rerouting. Emily frowned. I understand your concern, sir, but we've already been cleared for landing. The captain is in control, and we follow their instructions. If there's any change in the plan, we'll be notified immediately. But the man didn't seem convinced. He looked to his companions for support, and they nodded in agreement. Emily could sense the growing tension. I've been flying for years, the man continued, his voice rising slightly, and I can tell when something's wrong. The weather reports don't look good, and I'm not comfortable with this flight landing in Miami. Emily paused. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this felt different. There was a level of concern in the man's voice that made her uneasy. Yet, she couldn't allow panic to spread, especially in front of the other passengers. Sir, I assure you, the captain has been monitoring the weather closely, and we are in constant communication with air traffic control, she said, her voice steady. Everything is being handled. But the man wasn't done. He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. You're not hearing me, are you? There's something going on. I've seen this before. I've heard rumors. I think this flight's been compromised. Emily's stomach sank. What was he implying? Was this just paranoia? Or was there something real behind his words? She tried to keep her composure, but his insistence was unsettling. She walked away, her mind spinning. She didn't know what to think. There was no sign of anything abnormal with the flight. Everything had been going according to plan. The weather was indeed slightly turbulent, but that was normal for Miami's approach. Yet, the more Emily thought about the passengers' words, the more uneasy she became. Back in the galley, Emily caught Chris's eye. He had noticed her reaction and was already walking toward her. What's going on? He asked quietly. Emily hesitated for a moment, weighing her words. I've seen the reports, Emily said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. But I can't shake the feeling that there's something more going on. Maybe it's nothing, but what if I'm missing something? Chris's eyes softened with understanding. Look, Em, I know you. You're an amazing flight attendant, and you trust your gut. But you've also got to trust the captain and the rest of the crew. They're the ones in control of this flight. Emily nodded, but her thoughts were racing. She couldn't ignore the possibility that there was something more serious at play. What if this passenger wasn't just being paranoid? What if there was a real issue with the flight plan? As the flight neared its descent into Miami, Emily made her decision. She couldn't just let the situation go without investigating further. She couldn't risk a repeat of the tensions from earlier flights, where a small issue had been ignored until it became a major problem. She went to the cockpit and knocked on the door. Captain Anderson, a calm and collected man who had flown for decades, looked up as she entered. Everything okay, Emily? Captain, Emily said, her voice steady but serious. I've got a passenger who's expressing some concerns about the weather. He's suggesting we shouldn't land in Miami. Captain Anderson raised an eyebrow but didn't dismiss her concerns. What kind of concerns? He's worried about turbulence, and he thinks there might be a risk with the landing, Emily explained. He's insisting that we reroute. Captain Anderson nodded, his expression unchanged. I've been in contact with air traffic control, and we're cleared for landing. The weather's a little rough, but it's nothing we can't handle. I'm confident in the plan. Emily took a deep breath. I trust you, Captain, but should I? Do you think I should reassure the passengers again? Some of them are starting to get worried. The captain smiled, his tone warm. You're doing a great job, Emily. I'll handle the landing, and you keep the passengers calm. That's your job. The plane descended into Miami smoothly, despite the occasional turbulence. Emily moved through the cabin, offering reassurance to the passengers. The man who had been so vocal earlier sat quietly now, his concerns seemingly alleviated as they approached the airport. When they landed without incident, Emily breathed a sigh of relief. The situation had been resolved, but her mind still lingered on the moment when she had questioned the captain's judgment. That night, as Emily sat in her hotel room, she reflected on the weight of her decision. She had acted on her instincts, but she had also trusted the expertise of the captain and the crew. It was a delicate balance of intuition and professionalism. The next day, Emily met with Chris and Rachel for their morning briefing. I'm proud of how we handled everything yesterday, Emily said. her voice filled with pride. But I also want to say, I had doubts. I second-guessed myself. I'm not sure if I should have done that. Chris looked at her and smiled. You're human, Em. We all have moments of doubt. But what matters is that you trusted the process. You didn't panic, and you did what you needed to do. Rachel nodded. Exactly. You communicated with the captain, you stayed calm with the passengers, and you made sure they felt safe. That's what leadership is. Emily smiled. For the first time in a while, she felt a sense of peace. She had learned another valuable lesson in her journey. Sometimes, leadership wasn't just about being decisive. It was about knowing when to trust others and when to lean on your team. It was about balancing your instincts with your professional responsibilities and knowing that you couldn't always have all the answers. The sun was setting over the Miami skyline as Emily and her crew boarded their next flight, bound for New York. It had been a long day, and despite the small victories and moments of reassurance she'd shared with her team, Emily's mind lingered on the unsettling encounter with the passenger on the last flight. The uneasy feeling had refused to leave her. What if, just for once, her gut had been wrong? What if the warning signs had been real and she dismissed them too quickly? She couldn't shake the thought that something had been lurking just beneath the surface, unspoken and unresolved. As they prepped the cabin for takeoff, Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of a message from the cockpit. Emily, Captain Anderson's voice crackled over the intercom. We've been given a direct route today. We'll be a bit ahead of schedule, but we're also facing some headwinds. The flight could be bumpy for a while, so make sure everyone's aware. Emily nodded, hearing his instructions loud and clear. She had learned by now that when the captain made a call, it was always with the best interest of everyone on board in mind. Her responsibility was to ensure the passengers were comfortable and prepared for the ride ahead. But as the aircraft soared into the sky, a new problem emerged, one that threatened not only the passengers' safety but Emily's own sense of duty. It was an hour into the flight when Emily was called to the galley by Rachel. There was an urgency in her tone that made Emily's heart race as she hurried over. Emily, Rachel said, voice low but urgent, I've just heard something. I think you need to know. Emily raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. What's going on? Rachel looked around to make sure no one was listening before speaking again. There's a situation in first class. A passenger, a regular, a big shot in the business world, is drunk. I've seen him before, and I know he's not supposed to be drinking that much. Emily's stomach twisted. She knew exactly who Rachel was talking about. Mitchell Kramer, a wealthy, influential entrepreneur who always had a tendency to push boundaries on his flights. Emily had always turned a blind eye when it came to his behavior, knowing how much clout he had in the industry. But this time, something felt different. Rachel, are you sure? He's causing a disturbance? Emily asked, her voice a mixture of concern and caution. Rachel nodded, her face tight with worry. He's stumbling around, making loud comments, and when I tried to ask him to stay in his seat, he just laughed it off. Honestly, I'm not sure what to do next. Emily was quiet for a moment. This wasn't just about handling a drunk passenger. Mitchell Kramer was someone who could easily make a call that would affect her career. He was well-connected, and many of her colleagues in the airline industry had warned her not to cross him. But Emily's gut told her that this time, there was no way she could ignore the situation. Okay, let's handle this calmly, Emily said, setting her jaw. I'll go speak to him. You stay here and make sure everything's okay. If you need backup, let me know. Rachel looked relieved, and Emily could see the fear in her eyes. This wasn't just another day on the job. It was a test, a moment where she would have to decide whether her loyalty to her profession outweighed the pressure of dealing with someone like Mitchell. Emily made her way to first class, trying to steady her nerves. The rowdy chatter in the cabin made her steps feel heavier, but she knew she couldn't avoid confronting Mitchell. When she arrived at his seat, he was leaning back, his tie loosened, and a glass of whiskey in hand. Mitchell, she said calmly, I need you to stay seated with your seatbelt fastened. We're encountering some turbulence, and I want to make sure you're safe. Mitchell blinked slowly and looked at her, clearly annoyed. Oh, it's you. What is it now, Emily? Can't you see I'm relaxing? Let the flight attendants do their thing. Emily felt a flicker of irritation, but she kept her voice steady. Mitchell, I understand you're trying to unwind, but I'm asking you to follow the rules. We need you to be seated, and I'll have to confiscate that drink if you don't comply." His eyes narrowed, a smile curling at the corners of his lips. "You're making a big deal out of nothing, sweetheart. I'm a paying customer. You can't do this." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She knew the stakes. This wasn't just about ensuring safety. It was about making a stand, no matter the consequences. She had dealt with unruly passengers before, but this time, there was something more personal at stake. "I can, and I will," Emily said, her voice unwavering. "The rules apply to everyone. Please, just sit down, and let's get through this safely." For a moment, Mitchell said nothing. Then, with a sharp exhale, he sat up and threw his drink into the cup holder. "Fine," he muttered, though his tone was laced with contempt. "But you'll regret this, Emily. You don't know who I am." Emily walked away, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. She had done the right thing, but a cold pit had formed in her stomach. Mitchell's warning echoed in her mind. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but there was something different about this encounter. The ramifications of her actions were far from clear. As the flight continued, Emily couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. Mitchell wasn't just any passenger. He was someone whose influence reached far beyond the cabin. She had made a stand, but now she was unsure of what would happen next. Would he go public with a complaint? Would her job be on the line? When the flight finally landed in New York, Emily felt as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, but she knew it was far from over. The moment she stepped off the plane, she was greeted by a stern-faced manager who was waiting for her. "Emily, I need to talk to you," the manager said, his tone serious. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She knew what this was about. The moment Emily entered the airport terminal, the air seemed thicker, more oppressive. The once bustling sound of passengers shuffling toward baggage claim and the hum of flight announcements faded into a dull roar. Her heart raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something she couldn't outrun. The manager, Derek, was waiting by the gate, standing with his arms crossed, a stern look on his face. As soon as Emily approached, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Emily," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk about your interaction with Mr. Kramer." Her stomach tightened. "I understand," Emily replied, her voice even, though she could feel the tension building. "Is there a problem?" Derek's gaze didn't soften. "Mr. Kramer filed a formal complaint after the flight. He claims you were rude and unprofessional toward him. He also mentioned that you embarrassed him in front of other passengers." Emily's throat went dry. "I wasn't rude. I simply asked him to comply with the safety instructions," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The rules apply to everyone." "I'm aware of that, Emily," Derek said, his tone still sharp. "But Mr. Kramer has a lot of influence in the industry. You know how these things work. A complaint from him could affect your standing here, possibly even your career." The words hit like a punch. She had made a stand, believing it was the right thing to do. But now it seemed like the consequences were more severe than she had imagined. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest. "I understand, Derek, but I was just doing my job. I followed protocol. If that's an issue, I'll take responsibility, but I stand by my actions." Derek sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I don't want to make this worse for you, Emily, but you need to understand the delicate nature of these situations. People like Mr. Kramer, people with power, they can make things very difficult for someone like you, no matter how well-intentioned you are." Emily felt a sting of frustration. Was her integrity worth so little in this industry? It wasn't just about doing her job anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, even if it meant standing alone. "Are you suggesting that I should have let him continue to drink and be disruptive?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "No, but there are ways to handle things without escalating them. You could have been more diplomatic. You've been a great flight attendant, Emily, but this incident could tarnish your record." The last words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking in. Emily knew that being a flight attendant, a role she loved, had always been a tightrope walk between maintaining professionalism and keeping the peace. But what if maintaining the peace meant sacrificing her principles? She couldn't wouldn't compromise on that. As Derek left, Emily sat down in a corner of the terminal, her mind racing. The future of her career suddenly felt uncertain. Mitchell Kramer was a powerful man, and her refusal to back down had already cost her in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Could she have handled it differently? Should she have just let him be? But deep down, she knew the answer. The thought of compromising her values, of letting someone bully her into submission, made her skin crawl. She had done the right thing. The decision had been hard, but it had been the only choice that made sense. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. She fumbled to pull it out, hoping it was some sort of reassurance or, at the very least, a distraction from her anxiety. It was a text from Rachel. "How'd it go?" "You good?" Emily quickly typed back, "Not sure yet, but I did what I had to do." She stared at the message for a moment before sending it. She didn't know what the next steps would be, but one thing was clear. She had made her choice. The next few days were a blur. Emily found herself on edge, constantly bracing for the inevitable fallout from Mitchell Kramer's complaint. She avoided her colleagues' eyes, knowing that the word about her confrontation with him had spread. The whispers were inevitable, and though most of her coworkers had been supportive in their own ways, the tension in the air was palpable. Finally, she received an email from her supervisor, requesting a meeting to discuss the situation. Emily wasn't sure what to expect, but she steeled herself for whatever came next. When she entered the office, her supervisor, Lisa, was sitting behind a desk, looking at the files with a neutral expression. "Have a seat, Emily," Lisa said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Emily sat, trying to appear composed. "I've reviewed the situation regarding Mr. Kramer's complaint," Lisa began. "We've had a chance to talk to the crew members on your flight, as well as check the records. I have to say, Emily, we're proud of how you handled yourself in a difficult situation." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Wait, you're not upset?" Lisa shook her head. "No. In fact, we're actually impressed by your commitment to passenger safety and professionalism. While Mr. Kramer's complaint was certainly inflammatory, our investigation showed that you followed all the appropriate procedures." Emily blinked, trying to process the relief that was flooding through her. "So, I'm not in trouble?" Lisa smiled. "No, Emily. Far from it. I'm not going to sugarcoat things. You made a bold decision. Not everyone would have had the guts to stand their ground against someone with Mr. Kramer's influence. But ultimately, we believe you acted in the best interests of the passengers." Emily's heart seemed to stop and then race with relief. "You're not going to punish me?" "No," Lisa said, shaking her head. "We recognize your professionalism, and we want to make sure you feel supported, not penalized." "You did the right thing, Emily." As Emily left the meeting, the weight that had been pressing on her chest for days began to lift. It wasn't over, of course. There would always be another challenge on the horizon. But for now, she had made it through. She had stood tall, and in doing so, she had preserved her integrity. In the end, it wasn't just about what she'd done for the passengers on that flight. It was about what she had done for herself. She had made a choice that would shape her future in the airline industry, a choice to trust her instincts, no matter the cost. The next few days passed in a strange haze for Emily. After the meeting with Lisa, she had expected to feel relieved, to get back to normal, but instead, her thoughts kept returning to Mitchell Kramer and the weight of the decision she had made. Despite the company's support, the lingering tension from her encounter with him remained in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Her shifts seemed quieter than usual. Colleagues were polite but distant, and she couldn't help but wonder if they were watching her every move, waiting to see if the fallout from her actions would truly come to fruition. Emily had always prided herself on being approachable, on being part of a team, but now she felt like an outsider. It was a busy morning when she was called into the office once again. She had just wrapped up a quick debriefing for a new flight, her mind still on her duties, when Lisa's message flashed up on her phone. "Can you meet me in the office?" Important. Her heart skipped a beat. The last time she had been called in, it was for a conversation about Mitchell Kramer, and that had been far from comforting. But Emily didn't hesitate. She headed straight to Lisa's office, her steps echoing in the quiet hallways. "Come in, Emily," Lisa called when she knocked. Emily opened the door and found Lisa seated at her desk, a folder in front of her. Her expression was unreadable, though Emily could see a glimmer of something in her eyes. Was it sympathy? Or something else? "Sit down," Lisa said, gesturing to the chair. "We need to talk about the next steps." Emily sat down, trying to prepare herself for whatever came next. "Is this about Mr. Kramer again?" she asked, though she hoped it wasn't. The thought of dealing with that man again made her stomach churn. Lisa shook her head. "No, not directly. But it does concern your position here. You've done well in the face of adversity, and I've been asked to speak with you about a potential opportunity." Emily blinked, confused. "Opportunity?" Lisa opened the folder and slid a few papers across the desk. "We've been reviewing the situation with your flight, and your professionalism hasn't gone unnoticed. The senior management team is considering offering you a leadership position. It's a new role that focuses on conflict resolution and managing difficult passenger interactions." Emily's heart raced. A leadership position? She had worked her way up, yes, but she had never expected anything like this to come so suddenly. "Wait, are you saying that they want me to?" Lisa nodded. "Yes. We believe you have the potential to shape the future of our cabin crew operations. You've shown that you can handle high-pressure situations with grace and integrity. The new role would involve overseeing training, developing strategies for managing unruly passengers, and stepping in when things escalate." Emily was stunned. She had always enjoyed her work as a flight attendant, and while the idea of leadership intrigued her, she hadn't seriously considered moving away from the front lines. The thought of leaving her fellow crew members behind made her uneasy, but at the same time, she felt a deep sense of pride. I don't know what to say," Emily said, her voice shaky. "This is a huge opportunity. But what about my team? I love being out there with them. I never imagined I'd be in a position like this." Lisa smiled. "I understand, Emily, and I want you to take your time to think this over. It's not an easy decision, but it's an incredible chance to make a real difference in how we handle difficult situations." That evening, Emily couldn't shake the thoughts swirling in her mind. A leadership role? She had always been part of the crew, working alongside others to create a seamless experience for passengers. But if she accepted this new position, everything would change. She would be responsible for guiding and training others, and that came with a level of authority she hadn't expected. As she sat on her couch that evening, her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "Hey, got a sec? We need to talk." Emily felt a wave of exhaustion hit her, but she knew that Rachel's message wasn't something she could ignore. Rachel had always been one of the few people Emily could trust without question. She quickly responded, "Sure. What's up?" It didn't take long for Rachel to call, and Emily could hear the urgency in her voice when she picked up. "Emily, listen, I don't know how to say this, but you've got to be careful." "Careful? About what?" Emily asked, sitting up straighter, her attention fully on the conversation. "It's Mitchell Kramer. I know you think this is all behind you, but I've been hearing rumors," Rachel said, her voice lowered to a whisper, "and they don't sound good. He's not giving up, Emily. He's been making calls, using his influence to make sure this doesn't go away." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? I thought the company had my back?" "They do," Rachel said quickly, "but that doesn't mean Mitchell won't continue to make life difficult for you. I've heard he's been speaking with higher-ups, trying to discredit you, saying you're bad for the company. He's powerful, Emily. You have to be prepared for what's coming." Emily felt a cold chill run through her. Mitchell Kramer hadn't just been an obstacle on that flight. He was becoming a shadow over her career. The prospect of a leadership position, something she had worked for, suddenly felt like a double-edged sword. What if it all came crashing down before she could even take a step forward? "I don't know what to do, Rachel," Emily confessed. "I thought I could handle this, but now I'm not so sure." Rachel was silent for a moment. "Just keep your head up, okay? Stay focused on what you believe in. If they offer you that role, take it. You've earned it. But be careful. There are always more forces at play than we see." The next day, Emily found herself in the same office with Lisa once again, this time with a different set of emotions. As Lisa spoke about the opportunity, Emily weighed the words in her mind, considering Rachel's warning. But for all the risks, there was one thing Emily knew for sure. She wasn't going to let anyone, not even Mitchell Kramer, dictate her future. She was going to take the opportunity, despite the challenges that awaited her. She had faced worse before, and she would do it again. But she had learned a valuable lesson from everything that had happened. The fight for what's right would never be easy, but it was always worth it. Emily sat at her kitchen table, staring at the email from the senior management team. The offer was still on the screen, the words in bold, promising a future she hadn't anticipated. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with questions about what the right move would be. She had decided to take the leadership role, but in the quiet of her apartment, the weight of that decision settled heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about training new flight attendants or managing unruly passengers. This position came with a new level of responsibility, one that could define the rest of her career. Could she handle it? Was she ready to step into the world of corporate politics, where the stakes were higher than ever? Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Rachel. "Hey, just checking in. You made a decision yet?" Emily stared at the screen for a long moment. It wasn't just about the job. It was about the way her life had changed since that fateful flight with Mitchell Kramer. She hadn't expected any of this, least of all the way the tension between them seemed to be growing. He was a shadow she couldn't shake, no matter how hard she tried to focus on the future. "Yes, I accepted the position," Emily typed back. "But I'm worried. Things with Kramer aren't over. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to come. I told you to be careful, Em. Just keep your guard up. You've earned this role. Don't let anyone take it from you." Emily sighed and closed her phone. Rachel's words lingered in her mind as she thought about the difficult road ahead. She was about to become the person she had always looked up to, someone who others would turn to for guidance. But with this new position came a new set of enemies, and Mitchell Kramer was the biggest of them all. The following week, Emily received an unexpected call. It was Lisa again, and this time, the tone of her voice was more serious than usual. "Emily, I need to meet with you. It's about the new role." Emily felt her stomach tighten. What could it be? Had something changed? She agreed to meet at the office immediately, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, Lisa was already seated, her expression tense. There was no sign of the warm smile Emily had come to expect from her supervisor. "Sit down," Lisa said quietly. "We've received some troubling news." Emily's heart pounded. "What's going on?" Lisa paused, her fingers tapping nervously on the desk. "Mitchell Kramer isn't letting up. In fact, it seems he's been pulling strings behind the scenes. We've received reports that he's been calling executives, trying to undermine your appointment. He's pushing for you to be removed from the leadership role before you even step into it." Emily froze. "He's what? But how?" "I don't have all the details yet, but he's been using his influence in ways we can't ignore. He's connected, Emily, and he's not going to back down easily." Emily felt a rush of frustration and disbelief. "This is unbelievable. I followed protocol. I did what was right, and now he's trying to ruin my career." "I know this isn't easy," Lisa said, her voice softer now, "but I want you to know that we're behind you. The decision to offer you the position wasn't just a formality. It was because we believe in your potential. But there's no denying that Kramer is making things difficult. If he continues to push, we might have to make a tough call." Emily's blood ran cold. The stakes had never been this high. Her career, her future, everything was on the line. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and now it felt like it could all slip through her fingers in an instant. "What can I do?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to protect you as best we can," Lisa said firmly. "But you need to prepare for what's coming. You might have to face Kramer in ways you haven't anticipated. This isn't just about your work anymore. It's about your reputation." Emily felt a wave of anger rise within her. She had been prepared for challenges in her career, but she never imagined her integrity would be questioned like this. She had done the right thing, and yet here she was, fighting against a powerful man who seemed to have all the resources to crush her. "Thank you, Lisa," Emily said, her voice shaking, "but I won't back down. I can't." Lisa nodded, her expression determined. "I'm glad to hear that, Emily. We'll do everything we can to support you. Just remember, you're not alone in this." As Emily left the meeting, her thoughts were swirling. She had been handed an incredible opportunity, but it was coming at a steep price. The power dynamics within the airline were more complex than she had imagined, and Mitchell Kramer was at the center of it all. She had hoped that things would settle down after the flight incident, but it was clear now that the true battle was just beginning. In the days that followed, Emily found herself walking a fine line between asserting her authority and maintaining her relationships with her colleagues. The tension was palpable. Some people were openly supportive, while others seemed more guarded. Emily knew that her every move would be scrutinized, and she couldn't afford to make a mistake. The more she thought about Kramer, the more she realized how far-reaching his influence truly was. He wasn't just an angry passenger anymore. He was a force in the industry, someone who could destroy careers with a single phone call. And yet, Emily refused to be intimidated. There was only one way forward. She would have to fight back, but on her own terms. The phone rang again, interrupting her thoughts. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize. Hesitant, Emily answered. "Hello?" "Emily, it's Mitchell Kramer." Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Mr. Kramer," she said, her voice steady. "What can I do for you?" "I think we need to talk," Kramer's voice came through, cold and calculated. "I've been hearing some things, and I don't think you fully understand the consequences of your actions." Emily clenched her fists. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm standing up for what's right, and if you have a problem with that, then maybe you should take it up with someone else." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Kramer finally spoke again, his tone shifting, almost mocking. "Oh, Emily, you're playing a dangerous game. Don't think for a second that you've won this." The call ended abruptly, and Emily sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. He wasn't done with her, and this fight was far from over. Emily couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, Mitchell Kramer's voice echoed in her mind. "You're playing a dangerous game." She had expected him to be angry after the flight incident, but this felt like more. It was as if he had declared a personal war, and now she was caught in the crossfire. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a pawn in a much larger game. But Emily wasn't one to back down from a fight, and she had made her decision. She had accepted the leadership position, and she was determined to see it through, no matter what it cost her. It was a quiet morning when Lisa called her again. Emily had hoped for a few days of peace, but it seemed that wasn't meant to be. The call was brief but urgent. "We need to meet." "There's been a development," Lisa said, her voice tight with tension. Emily felt her stomach drop. She already knew it wouldn't be good news. She quickly made her way to the office, where Lisa was waiting with a stack of papers in front of her. Her usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced with a look of concern. "Sit down, Emily," Lisa said, her eyes scanning the room as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "This is bad." Emily sat, her heart pounding in her chest. "What's going on?" Lisa took a deep breath before speaking. "Kramer's been more active than we thought. He's managed to get some of our senior executives on his side, and now he's making moves to have your appointment revoked." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. How? How is that even possible? "He's using everything he can. His connections, his influence. He's called in favors from high-ranking people in the company, and it's starting to make some of the board members question whether you're fit for this position. There's a meeting scheduled for tomorrow, and your future is on the agenda." Emily felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. She had hoped that by accepting the promotion, she would be stepping into a new chapter, one where she could lead, make a difference, and move beyond the incidents of the past. But now, it seemed like all of her hard work was for nothing. "What are we going to do?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to be strategic," Lisa replied. "I've been working behind the scenes to push back against Kramer's influence. But it's not going to be easy. He has a lot of power." Emily was silent for a moment, her mind racing. She had always known that her job wasn't going to be without challenges, but this was something entirely different. It wasn't just about her ability to do the job anymore. It was about protecting everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. "If this meeting goes the way Kramer wants, what does that mean for me?" Emily asked. Lisa hesitated, her face tight with concern. "It means you could lose everything. The leadership role, your reputation. It could all come crashing down. Emily clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't let that happen. She had worked too hard to let someone like Mitchell Kramer take it all away from her. But how? How could she fight back against someone who was so deeply entrenched in the company's power structure? You've got a lot of supporters here, Emily, Lisa said, as if reading her mind. But we need to make sure the right people know you've earned this position. It's not just about your work. It's about showing that you belong here. I won't let him win, Emily said, her voice firmer now. I'll do whatever it takes. The next day, the tension in the office was palpable. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that every step she took was being watched. She had become a focal point, and no matter how hard she tried to concentrate on the job at hand, she couldn't ignore the storm brewing around her. It was just before lunch when Lisa called her into her office once more. Emily's stomach twisted with anxiety as she walked in, her eyes meeting Lisa's grave expression. We have to talk strategy, Lisa said, motioning for Emily to sit. Emily sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was done feeling helpless. It was time to take control. I know we've been going back and forth on how to handle Kramer, Lisa began, but we need to move quickly. I've been working with a few people in the company who are on your side, but we need to rally support. You're not just fighting for your role, Emily. You're fighting for your career. You need to make your presence known. I'm ready, Emily said, her voice steady. I don't care what it takes. Lisa nodded, clearly impressed by her resolve. Good. You've got a lot of people who are rooting for you, but you've got to start making your voice heard. We need to have you in that meeting tomorrow, standing firm, showing them why you belong in that position. Emily nodded, her mind racing. The meeting was tomorrow. The weight of it pressed down on her, but she knew she had no other choice. She had to go in there and fight for herself, for everything she had worked for. The day of the meeting arrived too quickly. Emily stood before the mirror, adjusting her uniform for what felt like the 100th time. She had always prided herself on looking the part, on embodying the professionalism that came with her role. But today was different. Today wasn't just about looking the part. It was about proving that she deserved to be in that room, that she deserved the leadership role she had been offered. Her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. You've got this, Em. Stay strong. We're all behind you. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read the message. She had friends, she had allies. But was it enough to take down someone as powerful as Mitchell Kramer? As she walked into the boardroom, the energy in the room was thick with tension. Executives and senior management were already seated, their eyes focused on her. Mitchell Kramer was there too, seated at the far end of the table, his eyes cold and calculating. Emily took a deep breath and walked to her seat, her posture straight, her face calm. She was ready. She wasn't going to let Kramer or anyone else tear her down. The room was silent, the weight of the moment hanging over Emily like a storm cloud. She had walked into the boardroom with a sense of calm, but beneath the surface, her heart was pounding. This was it, the meeting that would decide her future. And in that room, surrounded by powerful people who held her fate in their hands, she couldn't afford to show weakness. Mitchell Kramer was seated at the far end of the long table, his eyes locked on her. He had been the source of her stress, her anxiety, her fears. But now, as she looked at him, all she felt was resolve. She wasn't going to let him win. Not today. Not ever. The CEO, a stern-looking man in his late 50s named Richard Hawthorne, cleared his throat and looked around the room. We're here today to discuss the appointment of Emily Carter to the leadership role, Richard said, his voice firm. There have been some concerns raised, and we need to address them. Emily, you've been given the floor. Please share your thoughts. Emily nodded, her gaze sweeping across the room. She knew this was her moment. The spotlight was on her, and she wasn't going to back down. Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne, Emily began, her voice steady. I understand that there are concerns about my leadership capabilities, especially after the recent events. But I'm here today to tell you that I am not just qualified for this position. I am more than ready to take on this role. Her voice echoed in the silence of the room, and she could feel every pair of eyes on her. It was a moment of truth. This was where she would either rise to the occasion or fall under pressure. She chose to rise. I've been with this company for years. I've worked my way up from the ground, and every step I've taken has been a reflection of my commitment to this airline. I've learned from every mistake, and I've never stopped striving to be better," Emily continued, her confidence growing with each word. "And yes, there have been obstacles. But I'm here to tell you that I am not defined by the challenges I've faced. I'm defined by how I overcome them." Emily glanced at Mitchell, who was sitting with his arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. He had been the one to create the most obstacles, to push her to the edge, but she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let him take it from her. "I've earned this position," she said, her voice now firm and unwavering. "I'm not here because of favors or connections. I'm here because I have the skills, the experience, and the drive to succeed. And I will not allow anyone, no matter how powerful, to take that away from me." Mitchell's face twitched, but he remained silent. Emily could feel the tension rise in the room as the executives exchanged glances. She knew they were weighing her words, but she wasn't finished yet. "I respect the process, and I respect the people who have supported me. But I also know that the strength of a leader isn't just about what they've accomplished, it's about what they stand for. I stand for integrity, for hard work, and for doing what's right, even when it's difficult," she said, her eyes meeting each person around the table. "And I'm asking you to stand with me." A heavy silence followed her words. The room was tense, everyone waiting for the next move. Mitchell shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming on the table. But Emily didn't flinch. She held her ground, waiting for the response that would shape her future. Richard Hawthorne cleared his throat again. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his tone measured. "Now, we'll hear from Mr. Kramer." Mitchell stood, his movement deliberate as he walked to the front of the room. His presence was imposing, and he wasted no time in addressing the group. "I'll be blunt," Mitchell began, his voice smooth but laced with underlying venom. "This decision is a mistake. Emily Carter is unqualified for this role. She's inexperienced and reckless. We've seen it on the job, and we've seen it in her actions. She's simply not the right fit for this company, and I'll make sure that's clear." Emily's heart raced, but she didn't let his words affect her. She had heard them before. This wasn't the first time he had tried to discredit her. She had spent too long letting his words get to her, but no more. She wasn't going to back down now. Mitchell continued, "She may have gotten this far on her own, but there are far more qualified candidates for this position, people who understand the stakes and know how to play the game." The insinuation in his words hung heavy in the air. He wasn't just questioning her qualifications, he was questioning her very worth. But Emily wasn't about to let him paint her as anything less than what she was: capable, driven, and more than ready to lead. She stood, her movements slow but purposeful. "Mr. Kramer, I understand your concerns, but I'm not here to play games. I'm here to do my job. I'm not interested in power struggles or petty politics. I'm interested in making this airline better, for our employees, our customers, and for the future." She turned to the executives, her gaze unwavering. "I am asking you to judge me on my merits, not on my past. I am ready for this role, and I will prove that to you every single day. You have my word." The room fell into another tense silence, but this time, it felt different. The weight of her words had settled in. One by one, the executives looked at each other, and then their gaze returned to Emily. Finally, Richard Hawthorne spoke. "Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Mr. Kramer. We've heard both sides, and now, it's time to make our decision." The room was still as the board members deliberated, the silence deafening. Emily stood there, her heart in her throat, waiting for the outcome that would define her future. After what felt like an eternity, Richard Hawthorne looked up. His voice was calm but firm. "We've made our decision." Emily held her breath. "Emily Carter will remain in the leadership role," he said, his words ringing out like a verdict. A wave of relief washed over Emily, but she didn't show it. She had earned this moment. She had fought for it, and now it was hers. Mitchell Kramer's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Emily thought he might protest. But he said nothing. He simply stood, his face betraying nothing but cold fury. With a final nod, Emily turned and walked out of the room, her head held high. She had won. Not just the role, but her dignity, her integrity, and the future she had always dreamed of. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?